A group of girls at the back of the room were giggling and pointing at James and Toya. "Did you see that?" one of them whispered to another. "It's like they're flirting." "I know, right?" another girl chimed in. "I bet they're totally into each other." Another group of students, sitting closer to James and Millie, were also discussing the situation. "I think James and Millie have more chemistry," one boy said. "They've been spending a lot of time together lately." "Yeah, but Toya's always been kind of jealous of their friendship," another boy replied. "I wouldn't be surprised if she's trying to come between them." James overheard some of the whispers and tried to ignore them, but it was difficult not to feel a little self-conscious. The rest of the class passed uneventfully, and soon, the final bell rang, signaling the start of their much-anticipated break. As students filtered out of the room, Millie caught up with James near the door. "You should stop by the dojo tomorrow," she said. "My dad's running some sparring sessions in the morning. You could watch or jump in if you feel up for it." "I'll be there," James said with a nod. "It'll be a nice change of pace." Millie smiled and waved goodbye as she headed off, leaving James alone with his thoughts. He walked home, the streets bustling with students celebrating the end of exams. But his mind was elsewhere. The lamp of time, the dungeon, and the combat skills he had used were still fresh in his memory, blending with the thought of real-world martial arts. James had barely reached home when his phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. The text read, "The National Judo Competition will be held at the end of summer vacation. They're expecting you to be there as a member of the judo club." James stared at the message for a moment, his mind briefly drifting back to his judo training. Between the dungeon battles, school exams, and thoughts of martial arts, he had almost forgotten about the competition. James quickly typed a reply, "I'll definitely be there. I'm planning on training at Millie's father's dojo over the summer. They've got a solid program running." Within seconds, Ryan responded, "Cool, I'll join too. I've trained there before. It'll be fun to get back into it." James smiled at the thought. Ryan was one of the more experienced members of their judo club and had spent years honing his skills at Millie's family dojo. Having a friend like Ryan to spar with would make the summer training sessions not only productive but enjoyable. It also gave James a sense of reassurance knowing he wasn't going to be the only one gearing up for the competition. After pocketing his phone, James walked into the living room where his mother, Farzana Khan, was waiting for him. She was a kind woman with soft eyes and a warm smile, always supportive of his academic and extracurricular activities. "James, how did the exams go?" she asked, her voice gentle but expectant. James took a deep breath and nodded. "They went fine, Mum. I'm pretty confident I'll be in the top 3 this time." Farzana's face lit up with pride. "That's wonderful to hear, James. You've been working hard, and I'm so proud of you. You know how much it means to me to see you doing well in your studies." James smiled, appreciating her support. She had always encouraged him to strike a balance between his academic pursuits and his other interests like judo and, unknowingly to her, his secret ventures into the Lamp of Time's dungeon. "Thanks, Mom," he said warmly, before excusing himself to head upstairs to his room. Once inside, James collapsed onto his bed, the day's events swirling in his mind. The upcoming judo competition, the summer at the dojo, and of course, the Lamp of Time dungeon, all weighed on him. Despite the distractions of the outside world, his thoughts kept returning to the mysterious lamp sitting on his desk. He had only cleared the midsection of level 1, which means there is more on level 1. Maybe there is place called boss room or whatever like a game. Hours passed, and James found himself staring at the lamp, its faint glow beckoning him. As evening settled, a soft chime echoed in his mind, and the familiar notification popped up in his vision. Notification: the oil in the Lamp of Time has been replenished. You may re-enter the dungeon. James sat up, his heartbeat quickening. The dungeon was calling him again, and this time, he felt more prepared. His battle with the rattlings had taught him a lot about his own strengths and weaknesses, and the idea of entering the next phase of the dungeon excited him. But before he could let his excitement carry him away, He knew he had to be smart about it. The rattlings had been difficult, but they were only the beginning. Whatever lay beyond the midsection would likely be much more dangerous. He would need to think strategically if he wanted to survive the next level. James reached for his phone and sent a quick text to Ryan. "Hey, I'll need your help sparring tomorrow. I'm working on some new techniques and could use a partner." Ryan's reply came almost immediately. "Sure thing. Meet me at the dojo in the morning. We'll go all out." James grinned, feeling a surge of excitement. Tomorrow would be the start of something bigger. Between Millie's dojo, the judo club's competition, and the mysterious lamp of time, he was at the cusp of a transformative summer. As he set his phone down, James glanced at the lamp again, wondering what kind of monsters or trials awaited him in the next phase of the dungeon. But this time, he felt more prepared, not just physically, but mentally. His experiences in the real world were beginning to blend with the skills he had learned in the dungeon, albeit it was too short, but he was eager to see how they would all come together. He leaned back against his bed, his mind wandering to the judo competition. The thought of competing at a national level thrilled him. It wasn't just about winning, although he certainly wanted to make his club proud, but about testing his limits. But also the idea of training at Millie's family dojo, under the watchful eye of masters like Kashim and Tia Chowdhury, made it even more appealing. They weren't just regular martial artists, they were legends in their field. If anyone could help him refine his techniques and elevate his skills to the next level, it was them. James smiled to himself. The summer ahead was going to be intense, but in the best possible way. There were endless opportunities to grow stronger between his friends, the dojo, and the lamp of time. But first, he needed to prepare for what was coming next in the dungeon. He stood up from his bed and approached the lamp, the soft glow reflecting off the surface of the ancient relic. Its power was vast, but so were the risks. He wrapped his fingers around the lamp, feeling the slight warmth that pulsed from it. He had learned the hard way that rushing in recklessly would only lead to disaster. This time, he would approach it with a plan. Before returning to the dungeon, he would study the techniques he had learned in judo and in Millie's dojo. Every move, every strike, and every block would be refined until they became second nature. With the oil replenished, he knew he could return to the dungeon at any time. But instead of rushing back immediately, he decided to wait. There was no need to rush. James placed the lamp back on the desk and pulled out his notebook. If he was going to face whatever was waiting for him in the dungeon, he needed a strategy. He began to jot down the various techniques he had been practicing, both from judo and from the moves he had used in the dungeon, like thunderclap and crisis mode. Each had its strengths, but they also had weaknesses that could be exploited by the next set of enemies. Tomorrow's sparring session with Ryan would be key. Ryan's years of experience in judo, combined with his familiarity with the dojo's techniques, would help James identify the gaps in his strategy. James closed his notebook and lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter both in the real world and in the mysterious dungeon. As sleep finally began to overtake him, one thought lingered in his mind: what lies beyond the midsection of level 1? Whatever it was, James was determined to be ready. A few days ago, at the Firefly headquarters, the managing director's office was its usual hive of activity. Stacks of reports lay neatly on the desk. Framed certificates lined the walls, and the soft hum of city traffic filtered through the large, tinted windows. Mr. Rahat, the managing director, sat behind his polished mahogany desk, going over some paperwork when his personal assistant, Ali, knocked lightly on the door and entered. "Sir," Ali began, a hint of tension in his voice, "the AGP, Mr. Sam, wants to meet with you." Rahat's pen froze mid-signature, and his eyebrows furrowed in surprise. He had dealt with AGP Sam several times in the past over various matters, but their communication had always been limited to phone calls or formal exchanges through intermediaries. This would be the first time the additional Inspector General of Police was visiting his office in person. Why now, and what could it be about? Rahat's mind quickly ran through the possibilities, but none of them seemed good. "Send him in," Rahat said after a brief pause, nodding to himself as if to reaffirm his own composure. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and positioned himself in front of his desk. Moments later, The door swung open, and Sam entered with the authority and presence befitting a man in his position. His posture was upright, his uniform crisp, and his expression though polite was unreadable. Rahat greeted him with an extended hand and a warm, professional smile. "Hello, Mr. Sam. It's an honor to have you here." Sam returned the gesture, shaking Rahat's hand but with a noticeably firm grip. "Thank you, Mr. Rahat," he replied, though his smile was thin, and his eyes carried a depth of purpose that Rahat found unsettling. After a few brief pleasantries about business and the city's affairs, Sam's demeanor suddenly shifted. The transition was subtle yet unmistakably the air in the room seemed to cool as Sam's eyes grew colder, harder, a sharp contrast to his earlier polite facade. "I have some other work to attend to," Sam said, his voice steady and devoid of warmth, "so I'll keep this brief." "Let's get to the reason I'm here." Rahat's muscles tensed slightly. He had faced difficult conversations before, many of them in this very office, but there was something different about this one. He nodded silently, letting Sam continue. Sam stepped closer, locking eyes with Rahat, his tone now ice cold. "I've gathered evidence of your wrongdoings," he began, his words dropping like stones into the still air. "But my hands are tied, so I can't take direct action against you, at least not yet." Rahat's stomach dropped. He had always been careful, meticulous even, in how he conducted his business dealings. What had Sam found? And more importantly, how much did he know? But before he could voice any of his concerns, Sam continued. However, Sam's voice grew sharper, more threatening. "If you or anyone from your organization harms my family, especially my son, I will destroy your company from its core. I've done it before, and I will do it again. Don't test me." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Rahat felt his throat tighten, but he maintained his composure, his face betraying none of the fear or shock he felt inside. Sam's eyes, now like twin shards of ice, bored into his own, making it clear that the threat was not a bluff. Then, just as quickly as the storm had come, Sam's expression softened. The fire in his gaze dimmed, replaced by an almost casual politeness once more. "I hope you have a good day," he said in an off-handed tone, as if they had just discussed the weather. Without waiting for a response, Sam turned and left, his footsteps echoing faintly as he disappeared through the door. Rahat remained frozen for a moment, standing behind his desk, his mind racing. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes. But its impact was profound. Sam's words echoed in his head, "Evidence of your wrongdoings and destroy your company from its core." What exactly had he uncovered? Rahat had plenty of skeletons in his closet, but he had always been careful, operating through layers of intermediaries and proxies. Sam's warning about his family, especially his son, added another layer of complexity. Why mention his son so specifically? And why issue such a personal threat? He slowly sat down, exhaling deeply. He needed to think, to reassess his position. His company was powerful, and he had influence in many circles, but Sam wasn't someone to be taken lightly. The ape had connections of his own, not to mention his authority as a senior figure in law enforcement. Meanwhile, as Sam sat in the backseat of his car, driving away from Firefly headquarters, he stared out of the window, his thoughts focused on someone far more personal than Rahat or his corporation. He muttered quietly to himself, "That's all I can do for you, James. I could solve everything happening around you easily, but you won't grow if I shield you from every challenge." He had been keeping tabs on his son, James, for quite some time now, watching as he navigated his way through life's obstacles. Sam knew that his position afforded him the power to remove those obstacles, to eliminate threats before they even reached James, but he had refrained from doing so. James needed to learn, to face adversity, and to overcome it on his own. Sam's gaze drifted to the cityscape beyond the windows, and a faint smile touched his lips. He loved his son, and there was no doubt in his mind that James had potential that he wouldn't allow to be wasted by intervening too much. But still, Sam was a further before anything else. If Rahat or anyone else ever crossed the line and targeted James directly, he wouldn't hesitate to act. The car pulled up to a stop at an intersection, and Sam's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced down to see a message from one of his informants. The information was a small but important piece of the puzzle in a much larger game he was playing, one that stretched far beyond the walls of Rahat's company. Sam sighed and pocketed the phone, mentally filing away the new information for later use. Back at Firefly headquarters, Rahat sat alone in his office, his gaze fixed on the scattered documents covering his desk. The gravity of recent events weighed heavily on his mind. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, feeling the pressure. He had built Firefly from the ground up alongside his father and two brothers, pouring years of effort, sacrifice, and ruthless ambition into both the legitimate and shadowy sides of their empire. But now, for the first time in years, he felt genuinely vulnerable. The conversation with Sam replayed in his mind, and Rahat realized that this was no ordinary threat. The ape was not bluffing, and there was no doubt that he had the means to follow through on his warning. Rahat had always been able to navigate the murky waters of business and politics, but this was something else entirely. What made it worse was the realization that if Sam had evidence of his wrongdoings, it wasn't just his company that was at risk. Rahat's entire reputation, his livelihood, and even his freedom could be on the line. He needed to act and quickly. Reaching for his phone, Rahat called Ali back into the office. The assistant entered promptly, sensing the urgency in his boss's demeanor. "Ali," Rahat began, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I need you to arrange a meeting with our legal team immediately and get in touch with our contacts in law enforcement. We need to know everything we can about Ape Sam, his connections, his Alyssa, everything. Leave no stone unturned." Ali nodded, jotting down the instructions before leaving the room. Rahat leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city beyond. He had survived many challenges in the past, but this one felt different. Sam wasn't just a man with power, he was a man with a personal vendetta, and those were the most dangerous kind of enemies. But Rahat wasn't about to go down without a fight. If Sam thought he could intimidate him into submission, he was in for a surprise. The next day, James arrived at the martial arts center with Ryan, both of them carrying their gear and an air of anticipation. The martial arts center was nothing short of impressive, sprawling, with training spaces for nearly every combat sport imaginable. Its reputation stretched far beyond the city, and walking through its doors always filled James with a mix of excitement and nerves. Although their primary focus was on improving their judo skills, James couldn't help but admire the variety of disciplines practiced within the walls of boxing, taekwondo, karate, and more. He had always been curious about expanding his knowledge beyond judo. As they entered, the rhythmic sounds of fists hitting pads, the thud of bodies grappling, and the sharp calls of instructors echoed throughout the center. James and Ryan moved through the bustling halls until they reached the designated judo floor, where they were greeted by a familiar face, Kashim Chowdhury, Millie's father. A tall, muscular man with an air of quiet authority, Kashim was a respected master in multiple martial arts and a man of discipline. "Good morning, sir," James greeted him with respect, bowing slightly. Ryan did the same, clearly familiar with the customs and rules of the dojo. Kashim's eyes lit up with a small smile as he observed the boys. "I'm glad to see you here, James," Kashim said, his voice deep yet kind. "Millie has told me you're eager to sharpen your skills, especially your judo. I'll be teaching you both today." James straightened up, smiling in response. "I'm ready to learn, sir." "Thank you for taking the time." Kashim nodded and turned to Ryan. "And you, Ryan, I expect you'll help James get up to speed. You've trained here before, so you know what I expect." Ryan smirked but nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir." "I'll try to keep up." Kashim's expression grew more serious as he folded his arms across his chest. "Before we begin, I want to make one thing clear," he said, looking directly at James. "When you spar today, you'll only be using judo techniques. I know you've developed a habit of mixing styles, but today is about mastering the fundamentals." "Agreed?" James chuckled, a bit sheepish. In previous sparring matches with Ryan, he had relied on a freestyle approach, blending techniques from skill list and his limited karate experience to secure quick victories. Today, though, Kashim wanted pure judo, and James respected that. "Understood, sir," James said. "I'll stick to judo." Ryan raised an eyebrow and grinned. "This should be interesting. No more sneaky punches or slaps, huh?" James playfully nudged Ryan as they both stepped onto the mat. The atmosphere immediately shifted as they took their positions, bowing to each other in respect. Kashim stepped back, watching with hawk-like focus, arms still crossed as he observed their every movement. "Begin," Kashim called. The match started slowly, with both boys circling each other, looking for an opening. James, though eager, stayed cautious, reminding himself to stick to the basics of footwork, balance, and leverage. Ryan was more experienced in judo, and he moved fluidly, his body relaxed yet ready to strike. James attempted the first move, stepping in for a nozotogari, a classic judo throw where he aimed to sweep Ryan's leg out from under him. But Ryan anticipated it, pivoting quickly and countering with a taitashi, a body drop throw that nearly sent James crashing to the mat. James narrowly avoided the full impact, regaining his balance and trying to reset his stance. The sparring match continued with both exchanging muvasa throws, counters, and grappling techniques. Kashim watched silently, nodding occasionally but saying nothing. His eyes were sharp, analyzing every movement, every flaw in their execution. After several minutes, Ryan finally managed to get the upper hand, throwing James cleanly onto the mat with a swift tip and soinage, a one-arm shoulder throw. James grunted as he hit the mat, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline and frustration. "Not bad, Ryan," James muttered, rolling to his feet. "You've been practicing." Ryan grinned, catching his breath. "Told you." "No more punches." Kashim stepped forward, clapping his hands once to signal the end of the match. "That was good," he said, his tone approving yet firm. "Both of you showed solid technique. But there's something we need to work on: your fitness." James and Ryan exchanged puzzled glances. They were both fairly active, but Kashim had noticed something they hadn't. "You have the form," Kashim continued, "but your endurance and strength need to improve if you're going to last in serious competition. Judo isn't just about technique. It's about lasting longer than your opponent, having the stamina to push through when you're tired, and the strength to execute throws when your body wants to give up." Kashim's words rang true. James could feel it in his own body. The fatigue had crept in faster than he expected, and his throws had lacked power in the later moments of the match. "For the next week, we're focusing on building your endurance and strength," Kashim said, gesturing to the far side of the room where a variety of training equipment lay. "Follow me." James and Ryan complied, following Kashim as he led them to the conditioning area. The next phase of training was brutal. Kashim had them doing exercises designed to test their limits: push-ups, squats, medicine ball throws, and various forms of cardio. There was no break between sets, and as sweat poured from their bodies, James felt his muscles burning in a way they hadn't in a long time. Despite the exhaustion, James pushed himself harder. He knew that this wasn't just about getting stronger for judo. It was about preparing himself for what lay ahead. The memories of his time in the dungeon and the lamp of time were still fresh, and he knew that if he wanted to survive the next challenge, whether it was in the real world or the strange otherworldly Ania, he needed every bit of strength and endurance he could build. Ryan, too, was struggling but determined. The competitiveness between them fueled their efforts, each pushing the other to go harder, faster. By the end of the hour, both boys were drenched in sweat, their muscles aching, but there was a sense of accomplishment. Kashim looked at them with approval, though his expression remained stern. "That's enough for today," Kashim said, his tone less harsh now. "You've both worked hard, and it's clear you're serious about improving. Keep this up, and you'll be ready for the national judo competition at the end of the summer." James and Ryan both nodded, too tired to speak but grateful for the guidance. As they left the dojo, the exhaustion of the day started to settle in. James felt a mix of fatigue and excitement coursing through him. Training at the dojo had been harder than he expected, but it was exactly what he needed. He glanced at Ryan, who was equally wiped out but grinning. "You ready for more of this tomorrow?" Ryan asked, his voice tired but teasing. James smirked, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, let's get ready to win that competition." As James walked home, The familiar sounds of the bustling city surrounded him, but his mind was elsewhere. The notification that popped up earlier still lingered in his thoughts. Congratulations. You have gained 1 con due to your stamina training under Kasham Chowdhury's guidance. It was a subtle yet important reminder of how closely the real world and his mysterious experience had begun to intertwine. His efforts in the physical world at training hard under Kasham's rigorous regimen had somehow directly influenced his stats, just like in a video game. James couldn't help but grin. So, it's really that easy to increase stats now? He thought to himself, the excitement bubbling under the surface. Of course, the training with Kasham wasn't easy by any means, but this clear feedback made all the sweat and exhaustion worth it. As he neared home, James started debating his next move. He considered returning to the gym for more physical training. However, after the intense session with Kasham, his body was crying for rest. His muscles still ached, and while he could push through, he knew it might be wiser to recover first. Plus, he reminded himself, the Lamp of Time's dungeon didn't require physical stamina. Inside that strange, otherworldly space, only his mental and emotional strength mattered. I've trained enough for today. Time to hit the dungeon, James decided. Once he arrived home, he was greeted by the familiar aroma of food wafting from the kitchen. His mother, Farzana Khan, was busy preparing lunch. He paused for a moment to chat with her. How was your training? She asked, her voice warm and filled with genuine interest. It went well, James replied. I trained at Millie's dad's dojo today. He's intense, but I learned a lot. Farzana smiled, pleased with his answer. That's good. It's important to keep growing, both physically and mentally. I'm proud of you for balancing it all so well. James returned her smile, feeling a sense of warmth from her words. Thanks, Mum. I'm doing my best. After their brief conversation, James headed to his room. As he closed the door behind him, his gaze immediately fell on the Lamp of Time, resting quietly on his desk. The lamp's faint glow seemed to beckon him, as if it held secrets waiting to be unlocked. This unassuming artifact had more power than anything else he had encountered. The last time he had used it, the oil inside had mysteriously replenished itself, giving him access once more to the strange, otherworldly dungeon. He crossed the room, his heart racing with anticipation. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he grabbed the lamp and ran his fingers over its surface. The lamp's warmth seeped into his skin, a reminder of the untold power it contained. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This time, he knew what to expect, but the dungeon was unpredictable, always shifting, always testing his limits. With a determined exhale, James torched the fire, watching as the lamp flickered to life. The world around him seemed to pause, the air growing still. In the blink of an eye, the familiar scene unfolded. A door appeared before him, standing ominously in the stillness. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, pushing the door open and entering the dungeon once more. The air was thick, almost tangible, and the distant sounds of movement echoed from the shadows. The dungeon was alive, ever shifting, and James knew better than to let his guard down. Before he could fully orient himself, he heard the scuttling of rattlings in the distance. His heart rate picked up, but unlike the first time he faced them, James now felt a bit more confident. He had learned from his past failures, and though he had been defeated several times before, each loss had taught him valuable lessons. James moved cautiously through the dungeon, staying alert for any traps or ambushes. The Lamp of Time had granted him abilities or skills he was still learning to harness fully. The combat training he had undergone in the real world would undoubtedly give him an edge here, but he needed to remain careful. This was a different kind of battlefield. Suddenly, two rattlings appeared from around the corner, their red eyes gleaming in the dim light. They were smaller than the ones he had encountered before, but their movements were fast and unpredictable. James took a deep breath, centering himself. He had been training for this moment both mentally and physically. He lunged forward, using a judo throw he had practiced earlier with Kasham. His hands grabbed the first rattling, and with a smooth motion, he sent it crashing to the ground. The second rattling charged at him, but James was ready. He dodged its attack and delivered a powerful strike, knocking it back. Within moments, the fight was over. The rattlings lay defeated, and James felt a surge of satisfaction. His training had paid off, both in the dojo and in the dungeon. A new notification appeared before his eyes. Victory. You have defeated 2 ratlings. EXP gained, 50. James wiped the sweat from his brow and allowed himself a moment to breathe. James noticed a new notification flashing before him, interrupting his thoughts after defeating the ratlings. The message caught him off guard, and his eyebrows furrowed in confusion as he read it. You have unlocked EXP points. You will gain 1 unallocated stat point for every 10,000 EXP earned. It was the first time James had seen something like this in his mysterious system, and it felt strikingly similar to leveling up in an RPG. This revelation made him pause for a moment, trying to make sense of what it all meant. Gaining EXP from defeating creatures, earning stat points to enhance his abilities. It was like living in a video game. James couldn't help but smile wryly, the absurdity of the situation settling in. Am I really going to end up as some kind of nuclear weapon if I keep this up? He thought with a chuckle. He had never imagined his life would take such a surreal turn, where defeating rat-like creatures in a dungeon would directly improve his real-world skills. But he didn't have much time to dwell on that thought. He quickly realized that earning those stat points would be crucial if he wanted to survive and progress further in the dungeon. The system's rules were clear. For every 10,000 EXP, he'd gain a point he could allocate to enhance his abilities. Whether it was strength, agility, endurance, or something else, James knew that accumulating these points would be the key to overcoming the increasingly difficult challenges ahead. His mind refocused on the task at hand. He hadn't come here just for idle contemplation. He needed to conquer the level 1 midsection of the dungeon, a notoriously difficult part that had bested him multiple times before. The objective was simple but brutal: defeat 20 rattling the scavengers of the dungeon, in a single run. These creatures were faster and more aggressive than the regular rattlings he had just fought, and their sheer numbers made the battle even more overwhelming. James had faced them before, and it had taken him 4 attempts, only when he used crisis mode, to finally clear the section on his previous run. But today, something felt different. His recent training with Kashim Chowdhury had sharpened his reflexes and improved his combat techniques, and with his newfound understanding of the dungeon's system, he felt more confident in his abilities. This time, he hoped to clear the midsection on his first try and move on to the final section of level 1. He steeled himself, taking a deep breath. As he began walking deeper into the dungeon, the air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the eerie sound of scurrying feet echoed through the stone corridors. He knew the rattling scavenge would be waiting for him up ahead, ready to swarm him the moment he stepped into their lair. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his mind remained focused. 20 of them. I just need to stay calm and pick them off one by one, he thought to himself, repeating it like a mantra. As he entered the midsection, the atmosphere shifted. The space opened up into a large, dimly lit chamber. Jagged rocks and crumbling walls lined the area, and in the distance, he saw movement. Dozens of glowing red eyes staring at him from the shadows. The rattling scavenge were here, just as he expected. With a burst of speed, the first wave of scavengers charged at him, their claws scraping against the stone floor as they closed the distance. James' muscles tensed, and he instinctively dropped into a defensive stance, recalling the moves Kashim had drilled into him. The first rattling lunged, but James sidestepped and grabbed its arm, using its momentum to flip it over with a smooth judo throw. The creature hit the ground hard, dazed, and James quickly delivered a swift kick to knock it out of the fight. Another scavenger was already upon him, but he was ready. He ducked under its wild swipe and countered with a powerful punch to its side, sending it crashing into the rocks. 2 down, 18 to go. The next few minutes were a blur of motion. The rattling scavenge came at him in waves, their screeches filling the air as they tried to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. But James was faster, more precise. He dodged, parried, and countered with practiced skill, using the narrow space of the chamber to his advantage. Each throw, strike, and kick was a testament to the hours of training he had put in, both in the dojo and in the dungeon. Despite the chaos, he remained calm, keeping his focus sharp, the sloth vision backing him up. for every scavenger that lunged at him. He found a way to counter it, slowly whittling down their numbers. His breathing was heavy, his muscles aching, but he refused to give in. He had come too far to fail now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last rattling scavenge fell to the ground, defeated. James stood amidst the scattered bodies, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. He had done it. He had cleared the midsection on his first attempt. A new notification appeared before his eyes. Midsection cleared. EXP gained, 500. James allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. Just as James expected, the final section of Level 1 featured even more rattling scavengers this time, 40 of them. James activated his enhanced sleuth view and dove into battle, knowing he had already fought through the midsection twice. 20 minutes later, James stood amidst the chaos of the final section of Level 1. His breath heavy but steady as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He had just defeated the last of the 40 rattling scavengers, his heart racing with the thrill of victory. The room was eerily silent now, the echoes of the battle fading into the dim corridors of the dungeon. James grinned, feeling a sense of accomplishment. This time, he had pushed his limits and emerged victorious. But just as that thought crossed his mind, something strange began to happen. The fallen rattling corpses, scattered across the floor, started to twitch and move, as though drawn to some unseen force. James's eyes widened as he watched in horror. One by one, the corpses merged, fusing together into a grotesque, massive creature. It stood over 10 feet tall, its body a twisted amalgamation of rattling limbs and heads. In its hands, the beast wielded a large, wooden weapon resembling a hockey stick, except this one was splintered and jagged, clearly designed for brutal combat. James instinctively took a step back, his muscles tensing as adrenaline surged through his veins. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its red eyes glowing menacingly. James quickly activated Sleuth View, his ultimate ability that slowed down time around him. The world seemed to slow, allowing him a moment to assess the situation. But even with the slowed time, he could see that this creature moved with unnatural speed and aggression. It wasn't like the other rattlings, this was something far more dangerous. Before James could act, the massive rattling swung its weapon with lightning speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. James barely had time to raise his arms in defense before the jagged weapon smashed into him, sending him flying across the chamber. His body crashed into the stone wall with a sickening thud, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When James came to, he found himself back at the Level 1 midsection, the familiar stone walls of the dungeon surrounding him. His head throbbed, and his body ached from the impact. He groaned, trying to shake off the dizziness. "What just happened?" he muttered, still trying to make sense of the sudden turn of events. The respawn had saved him from a fatal defeat, but it also meant that he had to start the section over again. His mind raced as he replayed the battle in his head. The creature, or whatever it was, had caught him off guard, and its strength was overwhelming. He hadn't even had a chance to exchange the points he earned from defeating the rattling scavengers, which could have boosted his stats and given him a better shot at surviving the fight. That thing. It's not like the others, James thought, clenching his fists. I need to approach this differently. Determined not to let the dungeon best him again, James began formulating a plan. He knew that brute force alone wouldn't be enough to defeat the creature. He needed to rely on his skills and strategy, not just raw power. First, he reviewed his abilities. Sleuth View was crucial, but the creature's speed was too much, even with time slowed. He would need to use it more tactically, not just to dodge, but to create openings for his attacks. Crisis Mode was another option, a special skill that allowed his body to move with perfect precision until his stamina dropped below 30%. However, activating it too early could leave him vulnerable in a drawn-out battle. He considered his offensive options. Kangaroo Cut, his powerful uppercut that utilized 80% of his total strength, could deal significant damage, but the creature's size and speed made it difficult to land. Snake Jab, with its increased speed, might be more effective in landing quick strikes, but would it be enough to wear the creature down? And then there was Thunderclap, his electric attack, which could potentially stun the creature, giving him the crucial seconds he needed to press an advantage. James took a deep breath, centering himself. He had fought through the midsection twice already, and while the battle had been grueling, it had also taught him valuable lessons. He couldn't rely on his abilities linear. He needed to think strategically and outmaneuver the creature. "All right," James muttered to himself. "Time to go again." He made his way back through the dungeon, clearing the midsection once more. His movements were more precise this time, every action calculated as he conserved his energy for the upcoming battle. As he reached the final section again, the familiar dread crept into his chest, but he steeled himself. He knew what was coming. The room was just as he had left it, the bodies of the rattling scavengers strewn across the floor. James braced himself as the corpses once again began to twitch and merge, forming the massive rattling creature. Its glowing red eyes locked onto him, and it let out a thunderous roar, brandishing its wooden weapon. This time, James was ready. As the creature charged, James activated Sloth View, slowing time just enough to give him the edge. The creature's movements were still fast, but now James could anticipate them. He ducked under its first swing, the jagged weapon missing him by inches. In one fluid motion, he countered with a snake jab, his fist striking the creature's side at 3 times his normal speed. It let out a pained screech but quickly recovered, swinging its weapon again. James leapt back, narrowly avoiding the blow. His breathing was steady, his mind focused. He activated Thunderclap, sending an electric shock through his fist as he delivered a powerful slap to the creature's arm. The shock stunned it momentarily, and James seized the opportunity. He followed up with a kangaroo cut, his uppercut connecting with the creature's jaw. The force of the blow sent it staggering back, its grip on the weapon faltering. But the fight was far from over. The creature let out a furious roar, its speed increasing as it launched a flurry of attacks. James activated Crisis Mode, his body moving automatically, dodging and countering each strike with precision. His stamina was draining fast, but he couldn't afford to lose focus now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James saw his opening. The creature was momentarily off balance, its massive frame struggling to recover from its last attack. James lunged forward, grabbing the creature's arm with bare grip and using all his strength to pull it off its feet. With a final, powerful strike, he brought the creature crashing to the ground. A notification appeared before his eyes. Boss defeated. EXP gained, 1500. You have received 1 wooden sword, which deals double pain. You have earned 2000 EXP by defeating 40 rattlings. James collapsed to the ground, exhausted but victorious. James stared at the wooden sword in his hand, giving it a few test swings. The weight felt balanced, the handle smooth in his grip, but there was nothing particularly special about it. To him, it seemed like any ordinary wooden sword, its double pain attribute likely only noticeable when actually landing a blow. Still, James wasn't exactly an expert in sword fighting, and he wasn't eager to rely on something so unfamiliar, especially not when he had more reliable skills in his arsenal. After a moment of contemplation, James sighed and strapped the sword to his back. It would serve as a backup, nothing more. He couldn't afford to lose focus, especially with what lay ahead. Level 2. He moved forward, entering the normal section of Level 2. The air here was thicker, the temperature colder, and the ambience more menacing. The walls, now a sickly green stone, seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. As James stepped into the first room, his senses heightened, eyes scanning for any signs of danger. And then, he saw 4 humanoid green creatures with short, stocky bodies and sharp, gleaming eyes. Goblins. They stood around, brandishing crude weapons like rusted swords and jagged clubs. Their faces twisted into snarls as soon as they noticed him. James clenched his fists, his body tensing as adrenaline surged through him. He had faced plenty of enemies before, but these goblins seemed different from the rattling scavengers. They were smarter, faster, and more coordinated. Without hesitation, the goblins charged at him. James quickly activated Sloth View, his surroundings slowing to a crawl. He sidestepped the first goblin's wild slash, countering with a snake jab to its side. His fist connected, but the creature barely flinched, recovering almost immediately and swinging its club with surprising speed. James dodged again, but the other goblins were closing in. Despite his best efforts, the goblins' coordination overwhelmed him. One after another, their attacks chipped away at his defenses, and soon James found himself cornered. Desperately, he activated crisis mode, allowing his body to automatically react with perfect precision. His movements became flawless, dodging and countering with smooth efficiency, but even this wasn't enough. The goblins were relentless, and their attacks were wearing him down. Within minutes, James was defeated. He respawned at the beginning of the level 2 normal section, frustration gnawing at him. "What am I doing wrong?" he muttered to himself, rubbing his temples as he replayed the fight in his mind. The goblins were different from anything he had faced before. They were faster than the ratlings, and their teamwork made it hard to isolate them one by one. James realized that brute force and quick reflexes weren't enough. These enemies required strategy. If he was going to survive and progress, he needed to rethink his approach. The key, he figured, was to exploit their weaknesses while minimizing his own. He took a deep breath and reviewed his abilities once again. Sloth View was a lifesaver, allowing him to slow time, but it wasn't effective if he couldn't land decisive blows. Crisis Mode was powerful, but it drained his stamina too quickly, and against multiple fast-moving enemies like the goblins, it wasn't enough to turn the tide. James' mind wandered to the wooden sword strapped to his back. He had dismissed it earlier, but now he wondered if it might be the key. The goblins' crude weapons could probably be countered by something that gave him extra reach. Plus, if the double pain effect worked, it could give him an edge by slowing them down or inflicting more damage than his fists. Deciding to give it a try, James stepped back into the room. The goblins were waiting, just as before, their gleaming eyes locked onto him. This time, however, James drew the wooden sword from his back, feeling its weight in his hand. As the goblins charged, James activated Sloth View once more, the world slowing to a crawl around him. He moved swiftly, positioning himself at an angle that allowed him to keep an eye on all 4 goblins at once. The first goblin swung its rusted sword, but James blocked it with the wooden blade, feeling the force reverberate through his arm. In the slowed down time, he noticed the goblin's pained expression. The double pain attribute was working. Seizing the moment, James countered with a swift strike to the goblin's torso. The creature let out a howl of pain, stumbling back as it clutched its side. Encouraged, James pressed forward, his strikes precise and quick. He wasn't used to sword fighting, but the wooden weapon was doing its job. Each hit caused the goblins to recoil in agony, giving him precious seconds to regroup and counter. However, the fight was far from over. The remaining goblins, seeing their companion fall, grew more aggressive. One goblin swung its club at James, aiming for his legs, but he leapt back just in time, countering with a thunderclap. The electric shock stunned the goblin, giving James the opportunity to follow up with a kangaroo cut, his uppercut landing squarely on the creature's jaw. It crumpled to the ground, defeated. But the remaining 2 goblins were relentless, attacking in unison. James' stamina was beginning to wane, and he knew he couldn't keep this up for much longer. Gritting his teeth, he activated crisis mode once again. His body moved automatically, dodging and countering with perfect precision. He parried one goblin's strike, then spun and delivered a swift kick to the other's chest, sending it crashing into the wall. With one final effort, James swung his wooden sword in a wide arc, striking both goblins at once. The force of the blow, combined with the double pain attribute, caused them to collapse in agony. James stood over them, breathing heavily as the room fell silent. A notification flashed before his eyes. Goblins defeated. EXP gained, 200. You have received 8 goblin ears. Each ratling had rewarded him with 25 EXP, and the goblins offered even more, 50 EXP each. James took a deep breath, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. His chest rose and fell heavily, his body still buzzing from the adrenaline of battle. He had finally managed to defeat the goblins. The wooden sword he had used, with its double pain attribute, had been far more effective than he had initially imagined. It turned the tide in his favor when things were looking grim. He glanced down at the 8 goblin ears he'd collected, picking one up and inspecting it closely. The sight was unpleasant, a bit gruesome, but he shrugged it off, thinking they might be useful. According to the system, Selling these goblin ears to the dungeon's buying house would earn him $0.2 for each one. Not much, but still something. He made a mental note to bring a backpack next time, thinking it would come in handy for larger hauls in future dungeon runs. As he wiped some sweat off his brow, he quickly checked his EXP bar. The display showed 5,650 EXP. Not bad, but still not enough to allocate any new stat points just yet. He would have to keep pushing if he wanted to hit the next level. Well, that was tougher than I thought, James muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. He knew that this was just the beginning. Level 2 was proving to be far more challenging than the first, and he would need to stay on his toes if he wanted to survive. He glanced down at his wooden sword, a small smile forming on his lips. It wasn't flashy, but it had gotten the job done. For now, he'd keep it close. James stood at the entrance of the level 2 early midsection, his heart racing in anticipation. He had barely caught his breath from defeating the goblins in the previous section, and now he was about to face an even greater challenge. The dungeon's eerie glow seemed to throb around him, as if the walls themselves were alive, feeding off his uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. In the dim light, James spotted the goblins almost immediately. 10 of them in total. 5 wielded rusted swords, while the other 5 stood further back, armed with crude bows. The archers were positioned strategically, making it clear they had no intention of letting him get close without a fight. The goblins snarled in unison, their eyes gleaming with malice as they watched James approach. Before he could even strategize or make his first move, the sharp twang of a bowstring echoed through the chamber. An arrow flew faster than he could react, striking him squarely in the neck. Pain erupted through his body like a lightning bolt. He staggered, gasping for air, as his vision blurred. Blood trickled down his neck, and his grip on his wooden sword weakened. Stumbling back, James tried to activate Sloth View, but the pain made it difficult to concentrate. The world around him slowed, but his reaction time remained sluggish. Before he could fully recover, the sword-wielding goblins rushed him. They moved in tight formation, their jagged blades flashing in the dungeon's dim light. In seconds, 4 more arrows found their marker, 2 in his chest, 1 in his thigh, and another embedding itself painfully into his shoulder. James's legs buckled under the assault, and his world faded to black. When he regained consciousness, he was lying on the cold stone floor at the entrance of the level 2 early section, exactly where he had respawned every other time he had been defeated. The dungeon's resurrection system had saved him once again, but not without cost. James groaned, pushing himself up slowly. His body still felt the ghostly remnants of the pain from the arrows, though the wounds had disappeared. He rubbed his neck, half expecting to feel the blood there, but there was nothing. Despite the dungeon's ability to revive him after each death, it could not spare him from the agony of the battle itself. The pain, however fleeting, was always real. He had no doubt about that. Immortal, but still vulnerable, he muttered to himself, rubbing his sore shoulder. This latest defeat wasn't the first time James had fallen to a swarm of goblins, but it was the first time he'd been taken down so swiftly. The archers were a problem, one he hadn't anticipated. He had assumed he could take on a larger group of goblins after his earlier victories in level 2, but this time, he had been sorely unprepared. Not ready, he admitted quietly, his frustration mounting. Not for that many enemies. He knew what he had to do. If he was going to make it through the early midsection, he needed to level up, improve his skills, and hone his strategy. He wasn't strong enough to face so many goblins, especially not when half of them were using ranged attacks. His reliance on Sloth View and Crisis Mode had proven useful, but against a coordinated group, they weren't enough. James made his decision quickly. He'd return to the level 1 dungeon and grind for experience, gathering as much EXP as possible before returning to face the goblins again. If he kept pushing forward without strengthening himself, he would just keep dying over and over. And so, with renewed resolve, James headed back to the level 1 dungeon. He spent the next couple of hours battling familiar enemies, the rattling scavengers, and the occasional feral goblin. The fights were far easier than before, allowing him to test out different combinations of abilities and practice his swordsmanship with the wooden blade. Each rattling rewarded him with 25 EXP, and while the experience gain was slower than in level 2, it was steady. James methodically worked through the enemies, one by one, allowing muscle memory to take over. His movements became more fluid, his strikes more precise, and his dodges more instinctive. Sloth view was becoming second nature to him, and though crisis mode drained his stamina quickly, he was learning how to use it more sparingly. Time slipped by as he continued his grind, and before he realized it, the Lamp of Time, a magical artifact that controlled his access to the dungeon owner, began to flicker. He glanced at it just in time to see the last few drops of oil burn away, and with that, the dungeon faded around him. He had been kicked out, forced to return to the real world until he could refill the lamp. James blinked as the familiar surroundings of his apartment came into view. The sudden shift from the chaotic, dim-lit dungeon to the stillness of his room always left him disoriented. He glanced at the clock on his desk. It started to run where he left it. The time was frozen. 9,850 EXP, he muttered, pulling up his stats screen to check his progress. He needed more if he was going to stand a chance in the level 2 early midsection. The goblins there were far more dangerous than he'd expected. He had learned the hard way that they wouldn't give him the luxury of a fair fight. Their archers were deadly accurate, and the sword-wielding goblins worked in perfect synchronization. He couldn't take them on without a better strategy. As he stretched and tried to shake off the lingering tension from his dungeon run, James couldn't help but replay the battle in his mind. He needed a way to neutralize the goblins' ranged attacks while keeping the sword-wielders at bay. The wooden sword had proven useful, but it wasn't enough on its own. His fists, while powerful in close combat, left him vulnerable to long-range attacks. James considered his options. He could invest in gear upgrades, maybe find a shield to deflect the arrows, or learn a new ability that could counter the goblins' coordinated attacks. He could also explore his skill tree more thoroughly. But more than anything, James knew he needed patience. Dungeon crawling was a marathon, not a sprint. Each failure was a lesson, and each death a chance to refine his approach. He had been too reckless in the level 2 midsection, overconfident after his previous victories. But now, with a clearer understanding of his limitations. The next day, James met up with Ryan for their usual training session. They were in the middle of a series of stamina exercises, sprints, push-ups, and endurance drills. It had become their regular routine, pushing each other to the limits of their physical abilities. Ryan, always competitive, loved these sessions, and while James appreciated the challenge, today, his mind was elsewhere. They took a break, chugging water and catching their breath. As they rested, Ryan's eyes wandered to the wooden sword sticking out of James' backpack. With a raised eyebrow, he pointed toward it. "What's with the sword, man? Planning on becoming a samurai or something?" Ryan joked, his usual playful grin spread across his face. James glanced at his backpack, pulling the sword out slightly for a better look. The wooden blade, though plain, had become a crucial part of his strategy for the dungeon. "Actually," James said, half smiling, "I'm thinking of learning swordsmanship." Ryan looked at him, the grin fading into curiosity. "Swordsmanship? You serious?" James nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, I figure it could help me with this game I'm playing." He hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to share. Ryan was his friend, but explaining the whole dungeon crawling experience might be a bit much. "I've been thinking it's not just for the game either. You know, it might help in other areas. Self-discipline, focus, that kind of stuff." Ryan chuckled. "Man, I don't know. The Martial Arts Center does have a swordsmanship class, but it's not exactly popular." He leaned back on his hands, looking at James skeptically. "You know why?" James shook his head, intrigued. "Why's that?" Ryan shrugged. "People think it's outdated. You've got kids learning MMA, boxing, and all this modern stuff. No one sees the point of using a sword in today's world. It just doesn't attract much attention. Most of the people who sign up just quit after a few sessions." James thought about that. Ryan had a point. Swordsmanship wasn't exactly a skill you needed in daily life, especially with more practical self-defense techniques available. But for James, this wasn't just about practicality. It was about something deeper. something instinctual. There was a connection he felt to the sword, a sense that mastering it might be key to overcoming the challenges in the dungeon. "I get that," James said, agreeing with Ryan's logic, "but it still feels like something I need to do. Maybe it's not popular, but I've got this gut feeling, you know?" Ryan shrugged, though he seemed to understand. "Hey, if you want to do it, go for it. There's this old guy at the center, Carlos. He's the one teaching it. You could check it out." James nodded, feeling more determined than ever. "Yeah, I think I will." Later that afternoon, James headed to the martial arts center. It was a familiar place, but he hadn't visited in a while, especially not the sections where less popular classes were held. After making his way through the main training areas, past the sounds of heavy bags being struck and mats filled with people practicing throws and grapples, James finally reached the small annex where the swordsmanship class took place. As he entered, James noticed there were only 4 students, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in traditional GI uniforms. The atmosphere was quiet and focused, a stark contrast to the intensity of the other training rooms. At the center of it all stood Carlos, the instructor. James recognized him immediately. Carlos was a well-built man in his late 40s, his posture straight, movements fluid, and his presence commanding. He wasn't the kind of person you would expect to teach an unpopular class. There was an air of discipline and experience about him that made it clear he was a serious martial artist. James took a deep breath and approached, bowing respectfully before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," he began, "I'd like to learn swordsmanship." "I heard you teach here." Carlos turned, his sharp eyes locking onto James. There was a brief moment of silence before he frowned, his expression one of clear disapproval. "No," he said firmly. The refusal caught James off guard. He blinked, taken aback by the abruptness of the response. "Why not?" he asked, unable to mask his surprise. Carlos crossed his arms, looking James up and down as if assessing him. "Too many kids come here out of curiosity, thinking they can pick up a sword and learn something flashy. They don't take it seriously. They quit the moment it gets tough or when they realize it's not as exciting as they imagined. I don't waste my time anymore." James frowned, feeling the weight of the rejection. He had expected some resistance, but not outright refusal. "I'm not like them," he said earnestly. "I'm not here to waste your time. I won't leave." Carlos narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. "You say that now, but I've heard it before. Everyone thinks they're committed until they're not." There was a moment of tense silence as James tried to figure out how to convince him. He thought of the dungeon, of the countless times he had respawned, beaten and bloodied, only to get back up and try again. He thought of the pain he had endured, the lessons he had learned, and the determination that had driven him to seek out swordsmanship in the first place. "I'm not going to quit," James said, his voice firmer this time. "I've been through worse, and I'll keep going no matter how hard it gets. I need to learn this." James stood in front of Carlos, his heart racing after the instructor's abrupt rejection. The silence in the room was thick, the 4 other students watching, waiting to see what Carlos would do next. James could feel the weight of their gazes, but he remained resolute, his earlier words echoing in his mind. "I won't quit." Carlos studied him for another moment before a faint smirk curled at the edge of his lips. "You want to learn swordsmanship?" His voice was calm, almost mocking. "Then show me you're worth my time. Beat one of my students in a one-on-one match." James blinked, taken aback by the sudden challenge. Before he could respond, a boy stepped forward from the line of students. He was about the same height as James but looked more seasoned, his posture confident and his eyes sharp. The boy gave a respectful bow to Carlos before turning to face James. "I'm Goni," he said simply, his tone steady and measured. James eyed him warily. He quickly checked Goni's stats through his interface. Combined stats, 410. James frowned inwardly. His own stats were sitting at a meager 244.5. In a normal fight, Goni would easily overpower him. But this wasn't just any fighter. James had an ace up his sleeve, Sloth Vision. Carlos gestured for them to step into the center of the room. The other students formed a loose circle around them, watching intently. "No tricks, no cunning move without sword, just swordsmanship," Carlos instructed, his eyes narrowing as he addressed both of them. "This is about skill, not power. James's grip tightened on his wooden sword. He hadn't expected a trial so soon, but there was no backing down now. If he wanted Carlos to take him seriously, he had to prove himself. Goni took a stance, holding his wooden blade in a practiced, poised grip, his eyes locked on James with sharp focus, betraying none of the doubt or hesitation that James felt. With a deep breath, James activated sloth vision, feeling the familiar sensation of time slowing around him. In this mode, 75 seconds would pass for every minute in the real world, giving James precious extra time to observe and react. But even with sloth vision, Goni's movements were faster, blindingly so. James barely had time to process his first strike. Goni lunged, his wooden sword a blur as it came down toward James's shoulder. Instinctively, James raised his blade to block. The wooden swords clashed with a sharp thwack, the force of the blow reverberating up James's arm. Goni didn't let up. He was relentless, attacking with precise, calculated strikes. Each slash and thrust was delivered with expert timing, leaving James no room to counterattack. He was forced onto the defensive, his sword constantly moving to block Goni's rapid assaults. He's fast, James thought, his mind racing to keep up. In sloth vision, he could see the attacks coming, but his body struggled to respond in time. Every time he tried to counter, Goni was already pulling back, anticipating his move. As the fight progressed, it became clear that Goni was no ordinary student. His footwork was impeccable, and his attacks were methodical, as though he'd been practicing for years. In contrast, James felt clumsy and out of sync, relying more on raw instinct than technique. For what felt like an eternity, they traded blows. Goni kept pushing, pressing his advantage, but James managed to block every attack. His muscles ached from the effort, his arms growing heavier with each swing. Sweat dripped down his face, his breathing becoming more labored with every passing second. Come on, there has to be an opening, James thought, searching for a gap in Goni's defense. But Goni was flawless, his form disciplined and tight. James could see the admiration in Goni's eyes, even through the haze of battle. Despite Goni's clear advantage, he was impressed by how James managed to block each attack, never allowing a clean hit. Minutes passed, and neither side had landed a decisive blow. James's sloth vision was wearing on him, draining his mental stamina. With each passing second, his muscles were screaming for rest, and his reflexes were slowing. On the other hand, Goni, though still standing strong, was beginning to tire as well. His attacks came a little slower, his breathing more ragged. Finally, Carlos called the match to a halt. Enough, he said, stepping forward. Both James and Goni lowered their weapons, breathing heavily. James's entire body ached from the intensity of the fight. He could barely keep himself from collapsing, his muscles screaming in protest. Goni, while still composed, looked worn out too. Carlos observed them both, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he turned to James. Not bad, he said, surprising James. You've got no formal training, but you blocked every single attack. James, still panting, nodded, unsure how to respond. He was exhausted, barely able to stand, but there was a small flicker of pride in his chest. He had held his ground. Carlos crossed his arms, studying James with newfound interest. Why do you want to learn the sword? He asked, his voice calm but probing. James didn't hesitate. Self-defense, he replied. Carlos raised an eyebrow, then laughed a deep, hearty laugh that echoed through the small training hall. Self-defense? He repeated, shaking his head. No one chooses the sword for self-defense. The sword is a weapon of attack, not defense. If you want to protect yourself, pick up a shield, or learn some practical hand-to-hand combat. James stayed silent, his gaze unwavering. He understood what Carlos was saying, but his reasons ran deeper than that. The sword wasn't just a weapon to him, it represented a challenge, a path to growth, both in the dungeon and in his own life. Carlos seemed to sense this. His laughter faded, and his expression softened, though there was still a hint of skepticism in his eyes. You blocked every attack, but you couldn't land a single one of your own, he said, almost as if testing James's resolve. I know, James admitted, his voice low. But I won't quit. I'll get better. Carlos studied him for a moment longer, then sighed. All right, he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I'll teach you." James's eyes widened in surprise. "You will?" Carlos nodded, though his expression remained stern. "But understand this, swordsmanship is a long, grueling path. It's not flashy, and it's not easy. Most people quit after a few months because they can't handle the discipline it requires. If you're serious, you'll have to commit to it fully." James nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm serious," he said firmly. Carlos gave him a small, approving nod. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. Be here at 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." With that, Carlos turned and walked away, signaling the end of their conversation. James stood there for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. Goni approached him, a faint smile on his face. "Not bad, man," Goni said, extending a hand. "You've got potential." James smiled back, shaking Goni's hand. "Thanks," he said, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're pretty good yourself." Goni chuckled. "Carlos doesn't just train anyone. If he's agreed to teach you, that means he sees something in you. Don't waste it." James nodded, the weight of Goni's words sinking in. He had earned Carlos's approval, but this was just the beginning. There was still so much to learn, so much to improve. James slung the wooden sword over his shoulder as he walked out of the martial arts center. His body ached from the match with Goni, and the tension from his encounter with Carlos still buzzed in his mind. Just as he reached for the door, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Millie, "Waiting for you outside by the exit." James raised an eyebrow, surprised. He hadn't expected Millie to be around. He quickened his pace, curious to see what she wanted. When he stepped outside, she was leaning casually against the wall near the exit, scrolling through her phone. She wore a simple outfit, a loose-fitting t-shirt, and jeans, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Something about her relaxed demeanor caught James off guard. Without thinking, the words left his mouth. "You look great," he said, almost absent-mindedly. Millie looked up, blinking in surprise. "What?" she asked, the faintest hint of a blush creeping up her cheeks. James realized what he had said and chuckled. "I mean, you just look nice." "That outfit suits you." Millie's usual tomboyish demeanor faltered for a moment, and she looked away, trying to hide her slight embarrassment. Thanks," she muttered, clearly not used to receiving compliments like that. "You're acting weird." James shrugged, smirking. "Just calling it like I see it." She rolled her eyes, trying to brush off the awkwardness, but there was a faint smile on her lips. "Let's just go." As they started walking, James glanced over at her. "So, why'd you call me out here? Something on your mind?" Millie hesitated for a moment, her hands in her pockets as they strolled along the sidewalk. "I don't know, I was just feeling a bit bored," she admitted. "Thought it'd be fun to hang out." James gave her a sideways look, half joking. "No other friends to bother today? No girl squad?" Millie snorted at that, shaking her head. "They're all busy or out of town for the break. I didn't feel like hanging out alone, so here we are." James chuckled. "Lucky me." He tilted his head slightly. "So, where are we headed then?" "You clearly had something in mind when you texted me." Millie smiled, her eyes brightening. "I do. Just follow me." "It's not too far." James, still feeling the soreness in his muscles from the earlier match, didn't mind the slower pace as they made their way through the streets. Despite her usual tough exterior, there was something relaxed and easy about being with Millie. It wasn't often they hung out like these, just the two of them, outside of school or their study sessions. He wondered what she had planned. After walking for a while, Millie led James to a large, indoor stadium. The structure was bustling with activity, and as they entered, the sound of cheers and squeaking sneakers echoed throughout the space. Inside, the air was thick with the energy of a live game. James looked around and realized the venue was used for basketball, volleyball, and even kabaddi matches. "Here?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. Millie nodded, gesturing to the basketball court at the center of the stadium. "Yeah, there's a game on today. Thought it'd be fun." James looked around, taking in the sights. He hadn't pegged Millie as a sports fan, let alone someone who would bring him to a basketball match. "I didn't know you were into basketball," he remarked, genuinely surprised. Millie scratched the back of her neck, looking a little sheepish. "I'm not, Really, she admitted. But I've been watching this anime about basketball lately, and it got me curious. I figured, why not check out a real game? James chuckled. He was a fan of anime too, so he didn't mind the idea. Which series? Kuroko no Basuke? He asked, already guessing. Millie grinned, her eyes lighting up. Yeah, the matches are so intense. I just had to see if it's anything like that in real life. James nodded, the idea growing on him. Alright, fair enough. Let's see what happens. They found a seat near the front, where they had a good view of the court. The game was already underway, and the crowd was alive with excitement. As they settled in, James noticed something surprising. One of the teams playing was from Banani High School, their school. He nudged Millie. Hey, check it out. That's our school team down there, he said, pointing to the players in blue jerseys. Millie leaned forward, eyes widening. No way. What are the odds? The game was in full swing, but it didn't take long for James to notice something odd. While the players from Banani High were giving it their all, they were clearly outmatched. Their opponents, a team from St. Abraham School, were dominating the court. Every shot from St. Abraham was precise, their passes crisp, and their defense impenetrable. In contrast, Banani's players seemed to be struggling just to keep up. Man, James muttered, wincing as one of Banani's players missed a shot. We're getting crushed out there. Millie, who had been watching with rapt attention, nodded. Yeah, it's kind of sad. St. Abraham is on another level. The scoreboard reflected the brutal disparity. St. Abraham 78, Banani High 45. The gap between the two teams was widening with every passing minute. Banani's players looked exhausted, their movements sluggish compared to the high-energy offense of St. Abraham. James sighed. I knew our school team wasn't the best, but this is rough. Millie, despite her usual tough girl attitude, looked genuinely sympathetic. Yeah, it's hard to watch. Makes you wonder how much time these guys put into training. They're probably out there every day, grinding, and still getting stomped. James nodded, his mind wandering back to his own training. Watching the basketball game reminded him of how hard it was to push past your limits, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against you. He thought about the match with Gurney earlier, how he'd barely been able to keep up despite all his effort. It's tough, but that's how it goes, James said. You train, and sometimes it still isn't enough. But that doesn't mean you give up. Millie glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. Since when did you get all philosophical? James grinned. Just something I've been thinking about lately. You keep pushing, even when you know you're outmatched. That's the only way to get better. Millie didn't respond for a moment, then she nodded, her expression softening. You're right. Guess that's true for more than just basketball. Huh? The rest of the game played out much as they expected. St. Abraham continued their relentless assault, and by the time the final buzzer rang, they had won by a staggering margin. Banani's players walked off the court, heads hanging low, but there was a faint sense of respect in the crowd. They had fought hard, even if the results weren't in their favor. As the crowd began to disperse, James and Millie stood up, ready to leave. Thanks for bringing me here, James said, turning to her. It was actually kind of fun. Millie smiled, the earlier awkwardness between them long gone. Yeah, I'm glad you came. We should do this more often. James nodded, feeling a newfound sense of camaraderie between them. Definitely. Maybe next time, we'll even see Banani win. Millie laughed. Yeah, maybe. As they left the stadium together, James couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. Not in a dramatic way, but subtly, like their friendship had deepened, even if neither of them acknowledged it out loud. As James and Millie were about to leave the stadium, the sound of someone calling out Millie's name stopped them in their tracks. Hey, Millie! James turned, curious to see who it was. Walking toward them was one of the players from St. Abraham, the star of the game, Joel. Tall, athletic, and with an aura of confidence, he was the kind of player who drew attention wherever he went. James recognized him as the ace of the match, the one who had led his team to an overwhelming victory against Banani High. For a moment, James wondered if Millie knew him. The familiarity in Joel's voice and the way he called her name with such casual confidence caught James off guard. But what surprised him even more was Millie's reaction. She stood still, almost frozen, her usual fiery energy replaced with an awkward stillness. There was something in her posture that felt uneasy. James glanced at her, confused by the sudden shift, but he decided not to say anything. Joel approached, his gaze fixed solely on Millie, ignoring James completely. "I knew you'd come," Joel said with a smirk. His voice filled with the kind of self-assuredness that only someone like him could pull off. Millie, however, didn't seem thrilled. In fact, she looked irritated. She avoided his gaze, crossing her arms defensively. "It's not like that," she replied, her voice a little too sharp. "It's just a coincidence. I didn't even know you were at St. Abraham." Joel chuckled, clearly not believing her. "Come on, Millie, don't lie. I know my sister told you I was here. She mentioned you still keep in touch." Millie rolled her eyes, clearly fed up with the conversation. "Don't be annoying, Joel. I came to watch Banana High, not you." Her words were biting, but James could sense the tension beneath the surface. There was history here, something he hadn't been aware of until now. He stayed silent, unsure of how to react, but watching the interaction carefully. Joel, unfazed by her coldness, simply shrugged. "That makes me sad," he said with a fake pout. "I was happy when I saw you in the stands. I thought you came to cheer for me." Millie's gaze hardened. "So you noticed, huh? Well, you're late. You never noticed me before, so it doesn't matter now." The subtle bitterness in her voice caught James's attention. This was more than just an old acquaintance here. They had a past, and it wasn't a pleasant one. Joel's confident demeanor faltered for just a moment after Millie's cutting remark, but he quickly recovered, glancing over at James for the first time since their conversation began. His eyes narrowed, and his teasing smile returned. "And who's this guy?" Joel asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Your new boyfriend." James felt the weight of Joel's gaze, but before he could respond, Millie acted. Clearly irritated by the direction the conversation was heading, she grabbed James's hand without hesitation. The gesture was sudden, but it made her point clear. "None of your business," she shot back, her voice sharp and decisive. James, caught off guard by the sudden physical contact, glanced at her in surprise, but Millie didn't meet his eyes. She was laser-focused on Joel, her irritation obvious. Without giving Joel a chance to reply, Millie turned on her heel, pulling James along with her as they walked away from the stadium. Joel stood there, watching them leave, his smirk fading as they disappeared into the distance. For a moment, James could feel Joel's eyes burning into his back, but he chose to ignore it. He didn't know what kind of history Millie and Joel shared, but whatever it was, it clearly wasn't something Millie wanted to revisit. As they walked in silence, Millie's grip on James's hand loosened, and she eventually let go once they were far enough from the stadium. James could tell that Millie was still upset, her mood a stark contrast to the carefree energy she had earlier. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should say something. On one hand, it wasn't his place to pry into Millie's personal life, especially if it involved something as sensitive as a past crush. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what had just happened. James couldn't shake the feeling that Millie's reaction wasn't as indifferent as she claimed. He knew she had been surprised when she first found out it was Banana High playing. Could she have really come here for Joel's match? He glanced at her sideways, debating whether or not to ask. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. "Was he your crush?" James asked, his voice careful, not wanting to push too hard. Millie sighed, rubbing her temples as if the entire situation had given her a headache. "He was my ex-crush," she admitted, her voice flat. "A long-forgotten one. Believe me, he means nothing to me now." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. There was a note of finality in her voice, as if she wanted to leave the conversation behind. Yet, he couldn't help but notice that her reaction to Joel's presence had been anything but indifferent. The way she had frozen, the tension in her words, and the fact that she had grabbed his hand, it all hinted at something unresolved. But James decided not to push. "All right," James said, nodding, keeping his tone light. "I believe you." Millie looked over at him, her expression softening a little. "Thanks," she muttered, though there was a hint of exhaustion in her voice. James could sense that there was more to the story, something deeper that Millie wasn't ready to talk about. But he respected her silence. Some things, he figured, were better left unsaid. As they continued walking away from the stadium, the awkwardness between them slowly began to fade. The tension that had settled over the moment was replaced with a more comfortable silence, though James couldn't shake the thought of Jewel's smug grin and the way Millie had reacted. He decided to change the subject. "So, you really used to have a crush on a guy like him?" Millie chuckled, a hint of her usual humor returning. "Yeah, well, we all make mistakes, don't we?" James laughed. "True. I guess everyone has that one embarrassing crush they'd rather forget." Millie shot him a playful look. "Yours was probably some girl from an anime, wasn't it?" James grinned, happy to see Millie lighten up. "Hey, I won't deny it. But hey, at least my crushes don't call me out in front of basketball stadiums." Millie laughed, the tension between them finally easing. Touch A tilde copyright. They continued walking, the conversation flowing more naturally now. The strange encounter with Jewel was fading into the background, though James knew it would linger in the back of his mind for a while. It wasn't every day you met someone who had such a strong effect on Millie, someone who could bring out a side of her that James hadn't seen before. But for now, that was a story for another time. As they walked through the city streets, heading toward no particular destination, James found himself appreciating the simplicity of the moment. Hanging out with Millie like this, just the two of them, felt different. It wasn't like their usual study sessions or group hangouts. There was something more personal about it, more real. He glanced over at her, wondering what other layers Millie had that he hadn't yet seen. Millie, for her part, seemed to have moved on from the awkward encounter with Jewel. She was back to her usual self, relaxed, confident, and with that mischievous glint in her eye that always kept James on his toes. "Thanks for coming out with me today," Millie said after a while, her voice softer than usual. "I know it wasn't exactly a normal hangout." James shrugged. "It was fun. And hey, I got to witness the great Millie stand her ground against a cocky basketball star. That alone made it worth it." Millie smiled, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, next time we'll do something less complicated." James nodded, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. "I'll hold you to that." As they walked off into the night, their bond strengthened by the day's events, James couldn't help but wonder what the future held for both of them. A few days ago, the tension in the school had been palpable. James, Ryan, and Saurov were huddled around a laptop in the school library, their eyes glued to the screen as they hunted online scammers. They had been working together on this project for weeks, and their progress had been impressive. The thrill of tracking down fraudulent activities brought them closer, fostering a bond that seemed unbreakable. But the excitement was suddenly overshadowed when a familiar figure stepped into the library. Lemon. The moment Lemon entered, a palpable wave of animosity swept through the room. His eyes locked onto James, and a surge of rage ignited within him. He wanted nothing more than to crush James's face in. The memory of humiliation, of being arrested and suspended from school for 2 months, flashed through Lemon's mind. It was James who had exposed his schemes, leading to his downfall. The police had caught him red-handed, and now he was back, simmering with resentment. James felt a chill run down his spine as he caught Lemon's glare. The anger radiating off him was almost tangible. Lemon had once ruled the school with an iron fist, known for his connections and intimidation tactics. But after his arrest, everything had changed. The 2 main charges against him are stealing smartphones and money from various students, and the attempted murder of Jamesa had sent shockwaves through the student body. Lemon had contemplated dropping out, but his new position at Firefly Group, a shady organization, meant he couldn't afford to leave. He had to stay in school, but it was a bitter pill to swallow. As Lemon walked past James, their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, the air was thick with unresolved tension. James knew that Lemon's return could spell trouble, and he could feel the weight of that danger pressing down on him. The call from Rahat. Not long before Lemon returned to school, he had received an unexpected phone call. It was from Rahat, the managing director of Firefly Group, a man who rarely bothered with junior employees like Lemon. When Lemon saw Rahat's name on his phone screen, he was taken aback. Firefly was an influential in both Brightside and underground organization, involved in a variety of illegal operations, but Lemon was just a small cog in the machine. He couldn't understand why Rahat, someone so high up the chain of command, would call him directly. Lemon had answered the call cautiously. "Hello, sir?" "Lemon." Rahat's deep voice was steady, almost casual, but there was a cold edge to it. "I've heard about your incident." Lemon's stomach tightened. He knew what Rahat was referring to. The humiliation, the arrest, the suspension, all that was tied to that incident with James. But why would Rahat care about something like that? Was Firefly upset with him for getting caught? "I was going to drop out of school," Lemon muttered, half expecting Rahat to agree that it was a good idea. But Rahat's response caught him off guard. "You're not dropping out." Lemon blinked in confusion. "Sir, yeah." "You'll stay in school," Rahat interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I know everything about what happened between you and James, and I need you to stay close to him." "Stay close," Lemon repeated, confused. He had expected Rahat to be furious with him, not give him orders to remain in school. "Observe him," Rahat continued. "Keep an eye on his activities. I don't want you to interfere or provoke him, understand? Just watch." Lemon swallowed. "But why? Don't ask questions," Rahat cut him off. "This is bigger than you. James is of interest to us, but we don't want him knowing that. Your job is to observe. Do not make contact. Do not provoke him. And above all, don't screw this up." Lemon was stunned. There was a part of him that wanted to push back, to ask Rahat why he was suddenly so interested in James. But he knew better than to question orders from someone like Rahat. If Firefly had its sights set on James, then Lemon had no choice but to comply. "I understand," Lemon replied, trying to sound as confident as possible. But inside, he was filled with questions. Why would Firefly care about a high school student like James? And what exactly was James involved in that it caught their attention? Rahat ended the call without another word, leaving Lemon to process the situation. His anger toward James hadn't faded, but now it was tempered with caution. Firefly was watching, and that meant Lemon had to be careful. He couldn't act on his impulses, not when there were larger forces at play. The shadow of observation. Back at school, Lemon tried his best to follow Rahat's orders. He kept his distance from James, watching him from afar, but his hatred was difficult to contain. Every time he saw James, memories of his suspension and the public disgrace he had suffered resurfaced. James, along with Ryan and Sauroff, had continued their activities, hunting down online scammers and hackers like it was a game. They were good at it, too, and that only made Lemon angrier. Lemon knew he couldn't directly watch James all the time. It was too risky, especially if James caught on. Instead, he decided to rely on his two gang members, Tony and Mark, both of whom had also been suspended alongside him for their roles in the scams. Tony and Mark were loyal to Lemon, and they shared his hatred for James. But Lemon made one thing clear to them: they were to observe only, nothing more. "Don't engage with him," Lemon instructed firmly, sitting with them in a secluded corner of the schoolyard. "Just watch. Report back to me at the end of each day. But don't get involved, no matter what." Tony, the larger of the two, frowned. "What if we get a chance to teach him a lesson? Just a quick one, you know? No one has to know it was us." Lemon shook his head. We can't risk it. We're on thin ice with the administration as it is. One wrong move, and we're out for good." Mark, always the quieter of the two, nodded in agreement. "All right, boss. We'll keep an eye on him." But it's hard not to want to smack that smug look off his face. Lemon understood the sentiment. Every fiber of his being wanted to make James pay for what he had done, but Rahat's orders were clear. Firefly had bigger plans, and if Lemon wanted to stay in the organization's good graces, he had to follow them to the letter. And so, the days passed with Tony and Mark trailing James, reporting back to Lemon at the end of each day. They described how James spent his time here hanging out with Ryan and Sauroff, occasionally helping out at the judo club, and, more recently, meeting with Carlos, the swordsmanship instructor. Lemon listened intently, trying to piece together why Firefly might be interested in James. So far, there was nothing out of the ordinary. James was a smart kid, sure, but nothing about him seemed to warrant Firefly's attention. But Lemon knew better than to question Rahat's motives. Firefly always had its reasons, even if they weren't immediately clear. For now, Lemon would do what he was told. He would watch James, keep his distance, and bide his time. But the anger inside him simmered, just beneath the surface, waiting for the day when he could finally settle the score. Because no matter what Rahat had said, Lemon wasn't about to let James off the hook that easily. Not after what he had done. Extra. As the days passed, Lemon's plan unfolded. Tony and Mark reported back daily, their updates filling him with a mix of irritation and envy. James was thriving, seemingly unaffected by Lemon's presence. He was still immersed in his studies and training for the upcoming swordsmanship class, his bond with Ryan and Saroff strengthening. Meanwhile, Lemon grew increasingly agitated. The more he watched, the more he wanted to confront James. But each time he felt the urge rise, he remembered Rahat's warning, just observe. It felt like a prison sentence, shackling him to his resentment while he watched his enemy flourish. One day, after receiving another report from Tony and Mark about James spending time with Millie, Lemon felt his anger boil over. How could James just go on living his life while he was stuck in this hell? He slammed his fist on the table, catching the attention of a few nearby students. The humiliation of his past of being taken down by Jamisa washed over him once again, and he could feel the blood rush to his face. He had to do something, anything, to reclaim his power. Lemon's mind raced with possibilities. He thought back to the days when he ruled the school where his seat was just after 4 bully emperors, the fear he instilled in others, the way they backed away at the mere sight of him. Now, he felt like a ghost, lurking in the shadows while James took center stage. But as the anger simmered within him, a new idea formed: a way to turn the tables without directly confronting James. He could manipulate the situation from the sidelines. If he couldn't attack head-on, he could sow seeds of doubt, spread rumors, or even set traps. After all, he had 2 loyal followers who could help execute his plans without getting caught. Lemon spent the next few days concocting a strategy. He would have Tony and Mark spread subtle rumors about James. It was a way to destabilize his social standing and make him vulnerable. If James's friends turned against him, if his reputation suffered, then maybe, just maybe, Lemon could regain a sense of control. With a new fire in his belly, Lemon began to feel hopeful again. He had a plan, and this time, he wouldn't be the one humiliated. Instead, he would be the puppeteer, pulling the strings from the shadows while watching James unravel. As he plotted, however, he couldn't shake the sense that he was stepping into dangerous territory. But in Lemon's mind, there was no turning back. He was ready to wage war, and James would never see it coming. The thrill of the game returned, and this time, Lemon was determined to win. The air inside the Lamp of Time dungeon was thick with a stench that James had grown accustomed to during his repeated runs. Dim, flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows on the stone walls as he ventured into the level 1 area once again. The damp atmosphere was heavy, as if the dungeon itself was weighing on his shoulders. The sounds of distant scurrying echoed around him, indicating the presence of his target, the rattling scavenger. This was James' 3rd time inside the dungeon, but this time he wasn't aiming for the more dangerous level 2. Instead, he focused solely on mastering level 1, and more specifically, farming the rattling scavenger boss. The process was grueling, requiring patience and determination. Each encounter was a brutal test of his endurance. The rattling scavenger was a cunning and relentless creature, its sharp claws and agility making every battle feel like a test of both skill and willpower. After defeating the level 1, he exited the level 1 and entered it again. The dungeon was silent except for the faint echo of dripping water. James stepped into the dimly lit corridor, gripping his worn-out sword tightly. His body ached from previous battles, and the scars on his arms stung with every movement, but he pushed forward. He had to become stronger, and this was the only way to do it. As he approached the chamber of the rattling scavenger, the foul stench grew stronger, and he could hear the beast scuttling around. The boss was a grotesque rat-human hybrid, towering over him with matted fur, gnashing teeth, and bloodshot eyes. The moment it saw James, it let out a screech and lunged at him with ferocity. This time, James was ready. He sidestepped the initial attack and countered with a well-timed strike to the creature's side. The rattling howled in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop it. They exchanged blows, James using his agility to dodge its claws, while the beast used its weight and size to try and overpower him. Every swing of his sword sent shockwaves of pain through his arms, and every strike from the rattling left bruises on his body. But James refused to back down. He danced around the creature, looking for openings and exploiting them with precision. After what felt like an eternity, he managed to land a decisive blow, cutting deep into the rattling's neck. With a final, gurgling screech, the beast collapsed. James stood over its lifeless body, panting heavily. He felt a familiar rush, a mix of exhilaration and fatigue. It had been a grueling fight, but it was worth it. As he watched the creature disintegrate into black smoke, a notification popped up. You have defeated the rattling scavenger. Reward, plus 1,500 EXP. One more to go, James muttered, gripping his sword tighter. For the next several hours, James repeated the process. He returned to the dungeon entrance, rested briefly, and faced the rattling scavenger again. Each battle was more challenging than the last as his stamina wore thin. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his vision blurred, but he pressed on. His determination drove him forward, each fight pushing him closer to his limit. Finally, after his fifth and final battle, he collapsed to the ground, completely drained. The system notified him once more. You have earned 2 unallocated stat points. Nearly a third point before dungeon fatigue reached maximum. Breathing heavily, James allowed himself a moment of rest. He knew he couldn't push any further today. As he slowly rose to his feet, every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but a small smile crept onto his face. He had grown stronger, and that was all that mattered. Back in his room, James sat on his bed, staring at the floating screen in front of him. The glow from the screen illuminated the dark room, casting shadows on the walls. It was time to allocate his newly earned stat points. He considered his options carefully, replaying the battles in his mind. He could feel the fatigue in his body and knew that his strength was what had kept him alive in the dungeon. Without hesitation, he allocated both points to STR, watching as the numbers shifted. STR 50A 52, Con 55.1, Dex 44.9, INT 53.5, Wis 50.4, CHA 99. Seeing his stats updated brought a sense of accomplishment, but he was also aware of how far he still had to go. He needed to be stronger, faster, and more resilient. He was aiming to master his swordsmanship, and these stats were just a small step in that direction. James closed the screen with a sigh and lay down on his bed. The adrenaline from the dungeon battles had worn off, leaving him mentally and physically exhausted. He considered heading to the gym but decided against it. For today, he dressed. Tomorrow would be another battle, and he needed all the strength he could muster. The next morning, James arrived at the martial arts center where Carlos conducted his training. The instructor stood in the center of the training yard, his arms crossed, eyes sharp and focused. James bowed respectfully and picked up the sword Carlos had laid out for him. It wasn't the lightweight practice sword he had used previously. This one was heavier, requiring more strength to wield. Carlos gestured toward a marked line on the ground. Today, you'll swing 100 times. Each swing must be executed at a consistent interval of 2 seconds. If you miss the rhythm, you start over. James nodded, gripping the sword with both hands. He took a deep breath, cleared his mind, and began. The first swing felt powerful, the sword cutting through the air with a satisfying swish. He counted in his head, ensuring each swing was in time with the rhythm. But as the repetitions piled up, the weight of the sword became more burdensome, and his arms began to tremble. By the 60th swing, sweat dripped from his face, stinging his eyes. His breaths became ragged, and the sword felt as if it were made of lead. The urge to speed up and finish quickly was overwhelming, but he fought against it. He could not afford to make a mistake. Suddenly, his left arm faltered, throwing off his timing. He paused, letting out a frustrated groan. He knew what it meant to starting over. Carlos observed him without a word, his eyes never leaving James. Again, Carlos commanded. James nodded, swallowed his frustration, and started from the beginning. Each time he made it further, but each time, exhaustion got the better of him. It was only on his 5th attempt, at the 80th swing, that Carlos called it off. "That's enough," Carlos said, stepping forward. "I didn't expect you to reach 100 swings today. In fact, I would have been surprised if you did." James wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at Carlos in confusion. "Then why make me do it?" Carlos's eyes softened slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I wanted to see how you'd react when faced with an impossible task. Whether you'd get angry, frustrated, or give up." James stood silent, catching his breath, as Carlos continued. "You didn't give up, and you didn't let your frustration control you. That's why you'll continue training here. But make no mistake, tomorrow, you will complete those 100 swings, or you're out." James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I understand. Thank you." Suddenly, a chime echoed in his ears, and a notification appeared in his vision. Mission 25, complete 100 rhythmic swings, and you will be granted +2 dex. Penalty if you fail, you will be expelled from the sword class. A smile formed on James's lips as he acknowledged the challenge. This was what he needed, an objective to strive for, a tangible goal to achieve. As Carlos walked away, James stared down at his sword, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This weapon was no longer just a tool, it was a reflection of his journey, his struggles, and his determination. "Tomorrow, I'll reach 100, James muttered to himself, determination burning in his eyes. James's muscles were still sore from his sword training with Carlos, and then after doing dungeon run and gym, and the weight of his exhaustion pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. The dimly lit street ahead of him seemed endless, and the warm glow of streetlights offered little comfort as he made his way back home. It was late, and most people had already turned in for the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts. But something wasn't right. He felt a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, a warning, as if a pair of unseen eyes were watching him intently. James slowed his pace, his senses sharpening as he scanned his surroundings. In the months since he'd acquired the system, this heightened awareness had saved him more times than he cared to count. As he walked past a convenience store, he caught a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass window. He couldn't quite make out the details, but it was enough to confirm his suspicion. He was being followed. His heart rate quickened, but he didn't panic. Instead, James continued walking, appearing oblivious as he mentally mapped out an escape route. His body tensed, ready for action, but he maintained his casual stride. It wasn't the first time he'd been pursued, and he doubted it would be the last. However, something about this encounter felt different, more dangerous, more personal. He turned into a narrow alley and used the dim light to slip into the shadows. As soon as he was out of sight, he leapt up onto a low wall, his movements swift and soundless. Perched above the alleyway, he crouched low, blending into the darkness like a phantom. He waited, his eyes narrowing, ears straining to catch the faintest sound. The eerie silence was soon broken by the shuffling of footsteps, soft and measured. He watched as two girls passed by, laughing and chatting, seemingly without a care in the world. But James knew they weren't the ones following him. His instincts, honed by countless battles and close calls, told him that the real threat was still lurking nearby. A moment later, 4 men appeared at the mouth of the alley. They moved casually, but James could sense the underlying tension in their bodies. They were searching for something or someone. He gripped his wooden sword, feeling the grainy texture of the hilt under his fingers, and smirked. "Looking for someone?" James's voice echoed down from above, causing the 4 men to jolt in surprise. They looked around frantically, trying to locate the source, and finally, their eyes landed on James perched on the wall, watching them with an amused expression. The shortest of the group, a lanky teenager with an unruly mop of hair, blurted out, "How did you know?" The others shot him a look of exasperation, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man who appeared to be the leader, sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "You idiot," the leader muttered under his breath. "We weren't supposed to say anything." "Now we're exposed." James chuckled, twirling his wooden sword playfully. "You guys aren't exactly subtle, you know. Next time, try not to look so obvious when you're tailing someone." The leader's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "It doesn't matter. We're here for you, anyway." "Oh? And what makes you think you can take me on?" James jumped down from the wall, landing gracefully in front of them. He was tired, but his spirit was far from broken. In fact, this unexpected encounter was exactly what he needed to test his progress, and the thought of using his wooden sword to its fullest potential sent a thrill through him. One of them, a bulky guy with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped forward. "There are 4 of us and 1 of you. Are you really that eager to get beaten up?" James grinned, tapping the end of his sword against his shoulder. "Maybe, but I'd be more worried about this wooden sword if I were you. It has a special feature. Double the pain for every hit." Tattoo guy snorted. "Double pain? What kind of nonsense is that?" "You'll see soon enough," James replied, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He tightened his grip, readying himself for the inevitable clash. The men rushed him all at once, hoping to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. But James's reflexes were razor-sharp, and he sidestepped the first attack with ease. He swung his sword in a wide arc, catching Tattoo Guy square inches the ribs. The man let out a howl of pain, doubling over as if he'd been struck by a sledgehammer. The others froze, eyes wide in disbelief. "What the hell?" one of them shouted. "It's just a wooden sword." James didn't give them time to recover. He spun around, delivering a swift blow to another assailant's thigh. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg in agony, his face contorted in pain. The wooden sword was no ordinary weapon. It amplified the pain of each strike, turning what should have been a light bruise into a searing ache. "2 down," James taunted, his voice low and confident. "Who's next?" The remaining 2 men hesitated, glancing at each other. Their confidence was clearly shaken, but they couldn't back down now. The leader took a step forward, his expression hardened. "Don't underestimate us," he snarled, drawing a small dagger from his belt. He lunged at James, aiming for his midsection. James parried the attack with ease, his sword meeting the blade with a resounding crack. He twisted his wrist, knocking the dagger from the leader's hand, and delivered a punishing blow to his shoulder. The leader fell to one knee, gasping as the pain surged through his body. "Triple the pain this time," James muttered, watching as his opponent writhed on the ground. The last man standing backed away, fear etched across his face. "And no way," he stammered. "This guy is a monster." "Monster?" James repeated with a chuckle. "I'm just getting started." He dashed forward, closing the distance in an instant. Before the man could react, James delivered a precise strike to his abdomen. The man collapsed, moaning in pain. The fight drained out of him. Breathing heavily, James stood amidst the fallen men, his wooden sword resting at his side. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his arms trembled with the effort, but he felt an immense sense of satisfaction. He had fought well, and the double pain effect of his weapon had proven to be devastatingly effective. "Looks like that's a win for me," he said, more to himself than to his beaten opponents. One of the men groaned, trying to sit up. Who are you?" he managed to choke out. James didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving the men to their pain and confusion. As he rounded the corner, a familiar chime echoed in his mind, and a notification appeared before him. "You have defeated the ambushers. Bonus EXP awarded for utilizing a training weapon in combat. Plus 2000 EXP. James smirked. "Looks like the system's happy, too," he muttered, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. He made his way home, every step a reminder of his growing strength. Despite the aches and bruises, James felt more alive than he had in a long time. This battle, like the ones before it, had brought him one step closer to his goal. He couldn't wait to see what challenges awaited him next. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine that wafted through the open windows of the dojo. Sunlight filtered in, casting warm, golden patches across the wooden floor. Kashim Chowdhury, the judo instructor, stood tall at the center of the mat, his voice firm yet encouraging as he guided James and the others through a series of techniques. Despite the intensity of the session, James's mind wasn't entirely focused on judo today. He had another challenge waiting for him. "James, that's enough for today. You're pushing yourself hard, and that's good," Kashim said with a hint of approval as the class came to a close. "But remember, Balance is key in martial arts. You can't master everything at once. James nodded, bowing respectfully. Thank you, sir. I'll keep that in mind. As he left the mat, James couldn't help but glance over to the far side of the dojo, where he saw Millie standing with his sister, Lily. Millie's gaze met his briefly before she looked away, her expression thoughtful. Despite their recent interactions, there was still a sense of distance between them. James felt a pang of frustration. He couldn't pinpoint the reason, but it seemed like something was holding her back. Meanwhile, Lily, his older sister and the kickboxing instructor, was engaged in a conversation with Millie. Her long hair was tied back, and her sharp, focused eyes betrayed the concern she felt as she watched her younger brother. Want to go meet him? Lily asked, noting the way Millie's eyes kept drifting toward James. No, Millie replied, shaking her head, but she didn't seem entirely certain. But I'm a bit surprised that he's interested in swordsmanship now. I thought he was attending karate classes, then I heard he joined the judo club, and now he's training with a sword. It's like he can't settle on one style, and that's not ideal. How can he become good at anything if he's always switching? Lily's eyes softened as she continued watching James set up his practice area with his wooden sword. James has always been a bit different, she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. He's never been one to follow the beaten path. I used to think it was a flaw, but now a broken bar. I think he's just searching for something that resonates with him. Millie shifted uncomfortably. But isn't martial arts about dedication, about choosing one path and mastering it? Yes, Lily agreed. But sometimes, you have to try different paths to find your own way. Maybe he hasn't found it yet, or maybe a broken bar. She paused, her gaze never leaving her brother. Maybe he's trying to master something beyond just martial arts. Millie tilted her head, puzzled. What do you mean? Lily sighed, as if the weight of years had suddenly settled on her shoulders. James has always been fighting for something, whether it's respect, strength, or purpose. He hides it well, but I can see it. Every time he picks up a different style, he's searching for a piece of himself. She looked at Millie, a knowing smile playing on her lips. And you, of all people, should understand that. Taken aback, Millie remained silent, unable to articulate her thoughts. She watched James as he began practicing his swings, sweat already starting to form on his brow. There was a fierce determination in his eyes, an unyielding fire that refused to be extinguished. It was both inspiring and intimidating. I'll be heading to my own class, Lily said, snapping Millie out of her thoughts. But keep watching him. He is a good boy in heart. As Lily walked away, Millie continued to watch James. There was something captivating about the way he moved, the sheer effort he put into each swing, the unspoken pain and triumph that seemed to flow through him with every motion. She had seen many martial artists in her life, but none quite like him. Later that day, James was fully engrossed in his training, tuning out the world around him as he attempted to complete the 100 rhythmic swings assigned by Carlos. Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he refused to slow down. The wooden sword felt heavier with each passing swing, but he pushed through, ignoring the burning in his muscles. There was something liberating about this struggle, a sense of clarity that came with pushing himself to the limit. At last, he completed the 100th swing. He let out a ragged breath, his chest heaving. I did it, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He looked up to see Carlos leaning against the wall, a smug grin on his face. You surprise me, James, Carlos said, pushing himself off the wall and walking over. I didn't think you'd be able to do it. James wiped the sweat from his forehead, offering a weak smile. You were planning to kick me out from the start, weren't you? Carlos let out a chuckle. No, not exactly. I would have given you another chance, but you're the first to succeed on the first try. That takes determination. Thanks, James said, feeling a small swell of pride in his chest. So, what's next? Carlos's eyes narrowed, a wicked gleam flashing within them. Now, you'll do the same rhythmic swings, but while standing on one foot. James blinked, taken aback. You're joking, right? Carlos's expression didn't change. I'm not joking. Start now. James groaned inwardly but complied, lifting his left foot off the ground and steadying himself. He took a deep breath and began the first swing. Immediately, he felt the strain as his balance wavered, forcing him to adjust and readjust with each movement. By the time he reached the 10th swing, his leg was trembling, sweat pouring down his face. The task was impossible, or at least it felt that way. Carlos watched him with a hawk's eye, offering no encouragement, no reassurance, just silent judgment. James's frustration grew with every failed attempt, but he refused to give up. He kept swinging, even as his body screamed in protest. But eventually, his leg gave out, and he stumbled, catching himself just before hitting the floor. Pathetic, Carlos muttered, shaking his head. I thought you were better than this. James gritted his teeth, anger flaring within him. He grabbed the sword, ready to continue, but Carlos stopped him with a raised hand. Enough for today. You're exhausted, and you won't improve if you push yourself past your limit. Buta. No buts, Carlos interrupted, his voice firm. Martial arts or swordsmanship isn't just about physical strength. It's about knowing your limits and overcoming them one step at a time. James stood there, panting, frustration etched across his face. But deep down, he knew Carlos was right. He bowed his head. I understand. Good, Carlos said, his expression softening just a bit. You've got potential, kid. But potential means nothing if you don't have the discipline to back it up. Come back tomorrow, and we'll try again. As James began to gather his things, he noticed Millie approaching him, hesitantly. She seemed to be struggling with her words, unsure of what to say. You looked like you were struggling, she finally said, her voice softer than usual. You are always this reckless. James let out a tired laugh. Yeah, well, maybe I'm just trying to find my way. Millie crossed her arms, tilting her head. And do you think swordsmanship is the answer? I don't know, James admitted, his eyes meeting hers. But I have to keep trying, don't I? Millie frowned, unsure of how to respond. Just a broken bar. Don't push yourself too hard, okay? You can't master everything overnight. James offered her a tired smile. I know, but I can't stop either. I've come too far. James needs to explore every possible way to advance in the dungeon. If he has to switch to being an archer, he'll do it. No cap. She shook her head, unable to fully grasp his determination. You're a fool, she muttered, though there was no malice in her voice. In fact, there was something akin to admiration. Yeah, James agreed, his eyes gleaming with that familiar fire. But maybe that's what it takes. Millie watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller with each step, yet his presence somehow remained larger than life. She couldn't quite understand what drove him, or why he pushed himself so relentlessly, why he sought to master so many different forms of combat. But maybe, just maybe, that was the very thing that made him so captivating. As she turned to leave, she glanced back one last time, whispering under her breath, "Good luck, James." The dark, narrow corridors of the dungeon loomed ahead of James as he ventured deeper, his sword clutched tightly in his hand. Every step echoed ominously, the air thick with the stench of decay and the faint, metallic tang of blood. Despite the dungeon's oppressive atmosphere, James felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. After countless trips, the dungeon had become almost like a second home, a twisted, dangerous home, but one he had grown accustomed to. It wasn't long before the familiar chittering of rattlings reached his ears. Their yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting a predatory hunger that made James's heart beat faster. But this time, he didn't feel fear. Instead, a quiet determination settled within him. He took a deep breath, gripping his sword tighter as the first rattling lunged at him. James moved swiftly, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He sidestepped the creature's attack and brought his sword down in a clean arc, cleaving through its neck. The rattling collapsed into a cloud of black smoke, and James barely had a moment to catch his breath before another charged at him. As he continued battling the rattlings, James could feel the mental fatigue creeping in. His muscles screamed in protest, his arms felt like lead, and the constant strain was beginning to take its toll. Yet, something had changed within him. Every swing of his sword felt more precise, more controlled. He wasn't just hacking at the monsters, he was anticipating their movements, reacting to their attacks with a fluidity that came from hours of repetition and training. Come on, "Is that all you've got?" James muttered under his breath, dodging a particularly vicious swipe from one of the larger rattlings. He retaliated with a swift jab to its torso, watching with satisfaction as it stumbled back, clutching the wound. As the battle continued, James found himself adapting to the rattling's tactics. He began to notice patterns in their attacks, anticipating their movements with increasing accuracy. He learned to read their body language, understanding when they were about to lunge or retreat. The fights were still challenging, but James was becoming more than just a survivor. He was becoming a master of his craft. He started to feel a sense of rhythm in his movements, a flow that allowed him to effortlessly dodge attacks and counter with deadly precision. It was as if he had become one with his sword, his body moving instinctively in response to the rattling's assaults. The fights were no longer just a matter of brute force, they were a dance, a deadly ballet between man and beast. Yet, despite his progress, James couldn't ignore the slow trickle of experience points. Every kill brought him closer to gain another unallocated stat, but the respawn intervals for the monsters were agonizingly slow. He let out a frustrated sigh, leaning against the cool stone wall to catch his breath. He was tired, so tired, but he couldn't afford to stop. There was still so much more to do. "Maybe I'll finally get stronger to clean level 2, he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. Just a little bit more. Having accumulated 4 unallocated stat points, James felt a surge of excitement tinged with anxiety. He knew that every decision he made regarding his stats would impact his future battles, and there was no room for mistakes. He decided to allocate the points evenly between his strength, STR, and dexterity, Dex, bringing each up by 2 points, with his stats now reading STR, 55.9, Con, 56.1, Dex, 49.4, INT, 54.3, WIS, 51.3, and CHA, 102. He felt a rush of power coursing through him. The thrill of gaining more power was intoxicating, but he knew that this was only the beginning. With newfound determination, James stepped into the level 2 normal section. As soon as he entered, he was met with the sight of 4 goblins, short, muscular, and wielding crude weapons. Their eyes narrowed as they locked onto him, and without a moment's hesitation, they charged. "Time to put this training to the test," James muttered, activating his sloth view. Immediately, everything slowed down. What was 60 seconds for the real world stretched into 80 seconds for him, giving him ample time to assess the situation. The first goblin swung its rusted axe at him, but James calmly sidestepped, catching the creature's wrist and twisting it with a practiced motion. The goblin howled in pain, and before it could recover, James delivered a powerful slap across its face, knocking it off balance. The second goblin lunged at him, brandishing a jagged spear. James parried the attack with his sword, the rhythmic training he'd undergone the day before allowing him to counter with a swift, precise slash across the goblin's chest. It fell back, screeching in pain, and disintegrated into smoke. The third goblin attempted to attack him from behind, but James anticipated the move. With a swift spin, he gripped the goblin by its neck, lifted it off the ground, and brought his sword down in a heavy swing that cut through flesh and bone alike. The final goblin hesitated, fear flickering in its eyes. Its gaze darted round, searching for a way to escape. It was clear that the creature was terrified, its fear evident in its trembling body, wide, frightened eyes, and shallow, rapid breaths. The goblin's heart pounded in its chest, its blood racing through its veins. It was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or think. James took a step forward, his gaze locked onto the goblin. "Are you going to make this easy, or are we going to drag this out?" he taunted, raising his sword. The goblin's fear intensified, its eyes widening in terror. It let out a low, guttural growl, its voice trembling with fear. It lunged at him, its movements frantic and desperate, but its strikes were weak and inaccurate. James responded by driving his knee into its stomach, watching with satisfaction as it crumpled to the ground. As the goblin dissolved into smoke, James couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. He had never felt this in tune with his body before, and every movement seemed to flow effortlessly from one action to the next. He was starting to understand what Carlos meant when he spoke about finding rhythm in combat. James took a moment to catch his breath, feeling a rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't done yet. There were still 2 more goblins lurking in the shadows. The first 2 didn't die, watching him with wary eyes. Their hesitation only fueled his determination, and James decided it was time to use a skill he'd recently acquired. Snake jab, he whispered, feeling a surge of energy gather in his arm. In a flash, he thrust his sword forward, and to his surprise, the blade flew several meters through the air, piercing one of the goblins in the chest. The creature let out a strangled gasp before collapsing, its body disintegrating into smoke. "Got you," James muttered, retrieving his sword and turning to face the last remaining goblin. The creature stared at him with wide eyes, clearly shaken by the display of power. Without wasting any time, James employed his rhythmic slashing technique against the goblin. Taking a deep breath, James felt an immense amount of strength gather in his arms as he raised his sword high above his head. With every ounce of his strength channeled into a single, devastating slash, he brought the wooden blade down onto the goblin. The impact was immediate and explosive. The ground beneath the goblin cracked, sending a shockwave rippling outwards and causing the dungeon floor to tremble. The goblin's weapon shattered into pieces, and the sheer force of the attack sent the creature flying backward, slamming into the dungeon wall with a sickening thud. James stood there, panting heavily, his heart racing as he watched the goblin dissolve into smoke. He glanced down at his hands, still trembling from the exertion, and couldn't help but grin. This was power, a real, tangible power. It wasn't just about swinging a sword mindlessly, it was about channeling his strength, skill, and experience into a single, decisive blow. A familiar notification appeared before him. "Congratulations. You have received a new weapon skill, Earth Divider. Rank, C. Cooldown, 20 seconds. Description: when you slash downward, you can activate the Earth Divider skill by your will. It uses 100% of your total strength to create a huge impact." James couldn't suppress the excitement that welled up inside him. He had earned this skill through hard work and determination, and now it was his to wield. He closed his eyes, taking a moment to savor the victory. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was making real progress. This wasn't just about surviving Anamara, he was thriving. Wiping the sweat from his brow, James attached his sword in the back and turned toward the exit of the Level 2 early midsection. James entered the Level 2 early midsection with a sense of anticipation and determination. His eyes scanned the dimly lit, cavernous area, quickly locking onto the 8 goblins waiting for him. As usual, the group was divided. 4 goblins wielded crude, rusted swords while the other 4 stood back, drawing their bows, ready to rain down arrows on any who dared approach. James could feel the adrenaline already beginning to course through his veins. "This will be tough," he muttered, tightening his grip on his sword. He knew the goblins were far from being individually formidable, but in numbers, they presented a real threat. Without wasting any more time, he activated crisis mode. The world around James changed, and he felt the familiar rush of energy flood his body as the semi-auto battle mode took over. It was as if his body now moved independently, reacting with perfect precision and efficiency to every threat. The change in him was instantaneous. He was no longer just James, the fighter, he was a force of nature. The first of the sword-wielding goblins lunged at him, swinging its weapon in a wide arc. But before it could even close the distance, James's body reacted. He stepped forward, inside the goblin's range, and delivered a devastating kangaroo cut, uppercutting the creature with 80% of his total strength. The goblin was launched into the air, crashing against the stone ceiling before dropping to the floor as a pile of smoke. James didn't have time to savor the victory as another goblin charged. His body twisted, and his arm lashed out in a rapid snake jab. The goblin stumbled backward, clutching its throat, but James didn't stop there. With the agility of a seasoned predator, he spun on his heel, closing the gap between himself and the 2 archers who had begun drawing their bows. Arrows flew through the air, aimed directly at him, but James activated Sloth View, slowing down time just enough to allow him to twist and evade the projectiles with minimal effort. In a fluid motion, he swept forward and delivered a thunderclap to the first archer, sending an electric shock through its body that left it paralyzed. The second archer tried to retreat, but James's hand caught it in a bare grip, crushing its wrist with 40% of his strength before shoving it back against the wall with a powerful kick. In mere seconds, half of his enemies had been defeated. The remaining goblins hesitated, watching him with a mixture of fear and rage. But James was far from finished. He wasn't merely fighting he was strategizing, adapting to every movement, every attack pattern. He could feel his consciousness slipping further into crisis mode, his mind a silent observer as his body executed techniques with ruthless efficiency. One of the goblins swung its sword horizontally, aiming for James's midsection. In response, his body pivoted backward, avoiding the blade by a hair's breadth before retaliating with a powerful knee to the goblin's face. The knee hammer skill he'd learned from Arad. The goblin's skull cracked from the impact, and it crumpled into a lifeless heap. As another goblin charged from behind, James instinctively activated his crab's arm defensive skill. The goblin's blade bounced off James's arm, barely leaving a scratch. Before it could react, James brought his sword down with the earth divider technique, cleaving through the goblin and splitting the stone floor beneath it. The impact was massive, sending tremors through the room. However, even in this mode, James was not invincible. His stamina was draining rapidly. He could feel his legs growing heavier with each movement, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Yet, the crisis mode refused to let him rest, pushing him beyond his limits. Just a bit more, a broken bar, James thought, watching the last two goblins step back, wary of him. One of them tried to attack from behind once more, believing him to be too fatigued to react. But James anticipated it, catching the goblin's wrist mid-swing and wrenching it forward. With one last surge of strength, he drove his sword through the creature's chest. The final goblin, trembling in fear, attempted to run. But James, though exhausted, wasn't about to let it escape. With an almost effortless swipe, he sliced through its legs, bringing it to the ground, and then delivered a decisive blow to its head. As the last goblin dissolved into black smoke, James felt the crisis mode deactivate. His body immediately buckled under the strain. Also, he saw his 12 arrows were stuck on him. He collapsed onto the floor, his vision darkening as he felt every ounce of his energy drain from him. Too much, a broken bar. I pushed myself too much, he muttered before the world around him faded to black. James slowly regained consciousness, the dim glow of torches flickering against the cold, stone walls of the dungeon. He felt a dull, throbbing pain throughout his body, every muscle screaming in protest as he attempted to move. For a moment, panic surged through him. He was still in the dungeon, alone, and weakened. It looks like, just like every time he didn't died and respawned, he somewhat survived. I can't a broken bar stay here, he thought, forcing himself to sit up. His wooden sword lay beside him, cracked from the excessive strain of using the earth divider skill multiple times. He reached out to pick it up, but his fingers trembled, and he struggled to get a firm grip. You idiot, he muttered to himself, frustration bubbling up. You knew you weren't ready for this section, and you ate a broken bar. But deep down, he understood why he had pushed himself this hard. He wanted to be stronger, to prove to himself that he could handle the dungeon's challenges, that he could protect his friends and face the dangers waiting outside this labyrinth. But now, it seemed, his overconfidence had nearly cost him his life. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, James stood on shaky legs, using his sword as a crutch. He needed to get out of the dungeon and back to safety. He took a slow, agonizing step forward, his body screaming in protest. But he gritted his teeth and kept moving. The dungeon exit was only a few hundred meters away, but in his current state, it felt like an eternity. As the last flicker of light from the lamp of time dungeon faded away, James felt the familiar rush of energy envelop him. He had returned home, and just like every other time, his wounds healed, and the arrows that had pierced him moments before disappeared as if they had never existed. He let out a sigh of relief, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the battle. James could have chosen to die deliberately within the dungeon, allowing himself to respawn in full health, but his pride wouldn't permit it. Even in a place where death was merely a brief inconvenience, the idea of giving up and relying on that mechanic gnawed at him. He had faced his foes, conquered the challenges, and emerged victorious without succumbing to the easy way out. James muttered to himself, "Since when did I start thinking about pride and all that nonsense?" A bitter smile crept onto his face as he realized the truth of his situation. It seemed the system was influencing more than just his physical abilities. It was also altering his mentality in ways he hadn't anticipated. Thoughts he never used to consider were now creeping into his mind, making him reflect on his actions and emotions more deeply than ever before. Rising from the bed, he made his way downstairs, the smell of dinner wafting through the air. His parents had a routine that rarely intersected with his own, as his father, Samuel Khan, typically left before dawn and returned late at night. Today, however, Samuel was standing in the living room, a rare sight that surprised James. "Looks like you've grown quite a bit taller," Samuel remarked, his voice a mix of surprise and admiration. "Really?" James replied, looking down at himself. "I hadn't noticed." Samuel chuckled. "It's hard to miss. You're almost as tall as me now." Lily, James's sister, perked up from her spot on the couch, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. She had been so engrossed in her book that she hadn't noticed her brother's sudden growth spurt. Now that her attention had been drawn to him, she couldn't help but stare in amazement. He had grown so much taller in just a few months. She had always been proud of her height, but now, her brother was almost as tall as her. She felt a pang of disappointment, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of pride. She was proud of her brother for achieving so much in such a short time. Lily stood up and walked over to James, her eyes sparkling with admiration. She reached up and touched his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his skin. "You've grown so much," she said, her voice filled with wonder. James smiled. "I guess I have." Lily continued to examine him, her gaze moving from his face to his body. She noticed how his shoulders had broadened, and his arms had become more muscular. She couldn't believe how much he had changed since the last time she had seen him. James stood there, taken aback, as he suddenly realized he was indeed taller than Lily. The last time he had checked, she stood proudly at 5 feet 9 inches, her height something of a source of pride for her. But now, as he glanced down at her, he noticed he had reached past her. Checking his status screen, which he rarely paid attention to, James realized he was now 5 feet 10.5 inches tall, a significant jump from the 5 feet 7 inches he stood just 3 months ago. "Wow, I didn't even notice," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and wonder. The change felt surreal. He could feel the growth spurts manifesting not just in his stature but also in his confidence. "Guess the martial art training is paying off," Lily teased, crossing her arms as she inspected her brother with a critical eye. James chuckled, brushing off her remarks. "Or maybe I just had a late growth spurt." As he adjusted to the realization of his height, he could feel a sense of pride swelling in him. He had come a long way, not just in his physical capabilities but also in his mental fortitude. The countless hours spent honing his skills in the dungeons and martial arts were finally paying off, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Just then, James's mother, Farzana, entered the room, her expression curious as she noticed the lively discussion. "What are you all talking about?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth. "He hit his adolescent growth spurt, so he's getting taller," Lily explained, an amused smile on her face. "He's officially taller than me now." Farzana's eyes sparkled with excitement as she looked closely at her son. "Now that I see you, you're even cuter than before," she remarked, her voice dripping with maternal affection. James felt a pang of embarrassment at her words, his cheeks warming slightly. "So I wasn't cute before?" he asked, his tone playfully dramatic. At his response, laughter erupted in the room. His family's amusement filled the space with joy, and James couldn't help but smile, even as a part of him felt a bit downhearted. Farzana approached him, patting his head affectionately despite his newfound height, which had now surpassed hers. "You've always been cute in my eyes," she said, her tone serious yet filled with love. Lily grinned and said, "Well, You've definitely moved up. You're at least cuter than a monkey now. You're my cute little monkey." James sighed dramatically, feigning defeat. "Somehow, that makes me feel even sadder." The playful banter continued, their laughter echoing through the house, creating an atmosphere of warmth and belonging. In this moment, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for his family. The dungeons and the battles he faced were essential, but so was the support and love he received at home. No matter how tough things became outside, here, in the comfort of his family, he was just James, a son, a brother, someone cherished and loved. As the evening wore on, the three of them shared stories of their day. Samuel talked about work, recounting tales that made James laugh. Lily chimed in with her own experiences at school, the challenges she faced, and the small victories she achieved. The warmth of their camaraderie was a stark contrast to the isolation James often felt during his training sessions in the dungeons. Eventually, the topic shifted back to James's adventures. He shared snippets of his latest encounters, the strategies he employed, and how he had adapted to the challenges of the online scammers. His family listened intently, their expressions a mixture of awe and concern. They knew the dangers he faced, but they also saw the determination in his eyes, the spark that set him apart. "Be careful, James," Farzana cautioned, her voice soft but firm. "You're growing stronger, but remember, it's important to stay humble and not underestimate your opponents." James nodded, absorbing her words. He appreciated her concern, and in his heart, he promised to heed her advice. The confidence he gained in battle was empowering, but he understood the importance of balance. Humility was just as crucial as strength, a lesson he would carry with him into his future endeavors. "I know, Mom," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'll always remember your words." As dinner was served, they sat around the table, enjoying the meal and each other's company. The food was delicious, a mix of spices and flavors that spoke of Farzana's heritage. Each bite filled him with warmth and reminded him of the life he had outside the dungeon. A life filled with love, laughter, and the occasional playful bickering that made every day unique. After dinner, as they helped clear the table, James couldn't shake the feeling of contentment that enveloped him. In that moment, he realized that while the challenges in the dungeons and outside were crucial to his growth, the love and support of his family were equally essential. They were the ones who believed in him, who cheered him on, and who would always be there to catch him when he fell. As the nights wore on, he felt a sense of determination settle within him. He would continue to train, to push his limits, and to explore the depths of the dungeons. But he would also cherish these moments at home, understanding that they grounded him, reminding him of who he was and why he fought. Eventually, as they wrapped up their evening, James felt the mental fatigue of the day settle in. He bid his family good night, heading to his room. Despite the exhaustion from his recent dungeon battle, James knew he couldn't keep ignoring his academic responsibilities. The towering stack of textbooks on his desk seemed to taunt him, reminding him of all the assignments he had neglected during his break. He sat down, determined to make a dent in the workload. Hours ticked by as he worked through complex math problems, essay questions, and science reports. By the time he glanced at the clock, 5 hours had passed. The digital display read 3:00 a.m., and James felt an overwhelming sense of relief and accomplishment wash over him. The most challenging assignments were finally done, and he allowed himself to collapse into bed, feeling the weight of both academic and physical exhaustion pulling him into a deep sleep. The morning sun crept through his window, waking James far earlier than he'd have liked. He stretched, feeling the soreness in his muscles from yesterday's battle and his late-night study session. Despite the fatigue, he refused to skip his morning martial arts practice. He went through his routine, every punch and kick flowing with a rhythm that felt like second nature to him now. Afterward, James showered, dressed, and prepared for his meeting with Toya's grandmother. He took out his smartphone, hesitating for a moment before dialing the number. The line rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Come over when you're ready." Toya's voice was as curt as ever, but James could sense an underlying hint of something else, perhaps unease. When James arrived at Toya's grandmother's house, he knocked on the door. Toya answered, her eyes as cold and guarded as always. She stepped aside to let him in, but her expression didn't change. The house was quiet and empty, except for the ticking of a clock in the background. James followed Toya into the living room, where she gestured toward the couch. He sat down, feeling a bit out of place. Toya stood for a moment, her hands clasped behind her back. "Thank you," James replied politely as he entered the house, taking in the elegant yet cozy interior. It had been a while since he last visited, and he couldn't help but admire the warmth that the place exuded. "I'll call Grandma," Toya announced and disappeared down the hallway, leaving James alone for a moment. He felt a bit out of place but didn't have time to dwell on it as he soon heard footsteps approaching. Joya Rahman appeared, her face lighting up with a welcoming smile. "You finally found time to meet me," she greeted warmly, sitting across from him. James bowed his head slightly, apologizing. "I'm sorry for the delay. I had my exams." She waved her hand dismissively. "No need to apologize, dear. I'm just glad you're here." She paused, then added, "And I really appreciate what you did for me. Those scammers using my ID card, preying on innocent children in a broken bar. You've saved me from a lot of headaches." James smiled modestly. "It was the least I could do, Mom. I know how important it is to protect children, and I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I hadn't helped you. I'm glad I was able to make a difference." Joya was touched by James' sincerity. "You're a good young man," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm so grateful to have you in my life." Their conversation flowed easily after that, and James felt himself relaxing. It was nice to engage in something other than fighting for once. As they spoke, he noticed Toya returning with a cup of tea, which she handed to him a bit more forcefully than necessary. "Drink it quickly," Toya muttered, shooting him a pointed look that left no room for argument. Her eyes narrowed, as if she were daring him to disobey her. James hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He knew that Toya was not a particularly friendly person, and he didn't want to provoke her. However, he also didn't want to make her any angrier than she already was. Finally, he took a sip of the tea, careful not to make it too loud. Toya seemed satisfied with his response, and she turned away without saying anything further. Joya laughed at her granddaughter's behavior. "Don't mind her. She's just not used to having guests." James smiled awkwardly. "I'll make sure to finish it quickly," he replied, turning to Toya. "And please, stop glaring at me like that. It's really unnerving." Toya huffed, but she didn't say anything else. As the conversation continued, James felt a sense of ease in Joya Rahman's presence. It was clear that she was a woman of wisdom and experience, and he genuinely enjoyed listening to her stories about the past. But then, the tone shifted. Joya leaned forward, a serious expression on her face. "Now, for the second reason I asked you to come," she began, her eyes briefly darting toward Toya. "I have a favor to ask of you." James leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "Of course. What can I help you with?" Joya paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need you to pretend to be my granddaughter's boyfriend for a few months." The room fell silent, and James could only blink, processing the words that didn't quite make sense. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend the absurd request. He felt a wave of confusion and disbelief wash over him. It was as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning, and his thoughts were scattered like leaves in the wind. "Excuse me?" he stammered, his voice barely audible, as he tried to find the right words to express his astonishment. The cup of tea that he had been holding trembled in his hand, and a few drops spilled onto his pants. Toya, standing beside him, looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her eyes widened in shock, and her jaw dropped open. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was the most absurd and outrageous thing she had ever heard in her life. She had never heard her grandmother say anything so ridiculous and outlandish. She was speechless, and her mind was racing as she tried to make sense of what she had just heard. She was angry, embarrassed, and humiliated. She felt like she had been betrayed by her own grandmother. She wanted to scream at her, to tell her how stupid and ridiculous this idea was. But she knew that she couldn't do that. She had to stay calm and collected, even though she was feeling anything but calm and collected. And finally she spilled it out anyway. "Grandma, what are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice rising in panic. Now, hear me out," Joya said calm, turning her gaze back to James. Toya has a stalker who's been causing us quite a bit of trouble. He's very persistent, and we need a way to get him to back off. Having you pretend to be her boyfriend would be the simplest way to do that. Toya clenched her fists, her face turning red with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. She was furious with her grandmother for even suggesting such a thing. She couldn't believe that her grandmother would actually ask someone to pretend to be her boyfriend, especially someone who was not even a friend or acquaintance. It was a complete violation of her privacy and dignity. Toya felt like she had been thrown under the bus, and she was not going to stand for it. She was determined to fight back against her grandmother's outrageous demand. She knew that she had to do something, or else she would be forever trapped in this nightmare. Why him, though? Out of all people, why did you choose him? Well, he's the one who helped us with the online scam, so I know we can trust him. Plus, you two go to the same school, Joya explained with a calm smile. James decided to brush off his discomfort with Toya and downed his tea in one gulp, the cold liquid barely refreshing but providing him with a momentary distraction. He set the cup down and focused on Joya, his curiosity piqued. "Can you give me more details?" he asked, trying to piece together the situation. "I mean, Toya's father is a high-ranking police officer. It's hard to believe that an ordinary stalker could pose a real threat to Toya." Mrs. Joya smiled at his astuteness. "You're quite perceptive, aren't you?" she said, her eyes twinkling. However, her expression quickly shifted as she sighed heavily. "But this isn't just any ordinary situation. Toya's father has a friend named Jakob, a politician. At a recent wedding, Jakob's son, Rakib, spotted Toya and made it clear to his father that he wants to marry her." Mrs. Joya smiled at his astuteness. "You're quite perceptive, aren't you?" she said, her eyes twinkling. However, her expression quickly shifted as she sighed heavily. "But this isn't just any ordinary situation. Toya's father has a friend named Jakob, a politician who is known for his ruthless ambition and his willingness to do anything to achieve his goals. Jakob is a man of great influence, and he has a reputation for being feared and respected in equal measure. He is a man who is not afraid to use his power to get what he wants, and he has been known to be quite ruthless in his pursuit of his goals. At a recent wedding, Jakob's son, Rakib, spotted Toya and made it clear to his father that he wants to marry her." James glanced at Toya, noticing the way her brows knitted together and her gaze drifted to the floor, avoiding eye contact. "That's child marriage. Toya is a teenager, and the legal age for marriage is 18, he protested, his voice rising slightly. Joya waved her hand dismissively. "That isn't the main issue here," she said. "Rakib is not a good person. He exploits his father's name to get away with all sorts of wrongdoing. If Toya's father, Kadir, weren't a policeman, he would have already forced her into marriage." She looked at James' angry face and continued, "Jakob's son, Rakib, is a spoiled and entitled young man who has been raised to believe that he is entitled to whatever he wants. He is a man of great privilege, and he has never had to work a day in his life. He is used to getting whatever he wants, and he is not afraid to use his father's influence to get his way. Rakib is a dangerous man, and he is capable of doing great harm. Rakib has been stalking Toya for several months now, and he has made it clear that he is determined to marry her. He has been harassing her, following her, and sending her threatening messages. Toya is terrified of Rakib, and she is afraid that he will do something to her. Jakob is aware of Rakib's obsession with Toya, and he has been trying to discourage him from pursuing her. However, Rakib is not listening to his father. He is determined to have Toya, and he is not going to let anything stand in his way. Joya is worried that Rakib will do something terrible to Toya. She knows that he is a dangerous man, and she is afraid that he will not stop until he has gotten what he wants. She believes that the only way to protect Toya is to get Rakib away from her. That is why she is asking James to pretend to be Toya's boyfriend. James felt a mix of outrage and disbelief. "But how can he get away with that?" he demanded, his fists clenching. "Someone has to put a stop to it. Trust me, if Kadir had more solid evidence, he would act," Joy replied, her voice steady yet filled with concern. "But Rakib is sly. He knows how to manipulate the situation to his advantage, and he's well protected by his father's influence. That's why we need you. James felt a surge of anger coursing through him, reminiscent of a painful memory involving his own sister. He recalled how a similar situation had arisen when a rich father's baby boy from their neighborhood had shown an inappropriate interest in her. The boy had been persistent and aggressive, and he had made it clear that he was determined to have her, no matter what. James's sister had been terrified, and she had begged her parents for help. Fortunately, James's father had been able to use his connections and authority to put an end to the harassment. The memory of that time was still painful for James, and it filled him with a sense of dread as he thought about what Toya might be going through. "I can't believe this is happening to Toya. This isn't right," he exclaimed, his voice filled with emotion. He then explained the situation with his sister, emphasizing the importance of protecting young women from such harmful situations. He told Joya how his sister had been traumatized by the experience, and how she had struggled to recover. He also explained how his father had been able to use his connections to get the boy into trouble, and how that had ultimately deterred him from pursuing his sister further. Joya nodded solemnly. "See, similar situations happen everywhere. But unlike your father, we can't resolve this easily. That's why I need you to pretend to be her boyfriend for a few months. Once that's in place, Kadia will have the necessary leverage to take action against Jacob and Rakib." James took a deep breath, weighing the gravity of the situation. "I understand," he said, his voice calmer now. "I'll do it. If it means protecting Toya, then I'll help however I can."